Welcome to War Sleep Stories. Today, we will be listening to relaxing war stories and sounds to make you fall asleep, but before that, kindly like and subscribe. Thank you.
The story of Operation Just Cause. The year was 1989, and the Panama City was filled with an uneasy tension. The bustling city streets, once filled with vibrant music and colorful markets, now echoed with whispers of uncertainty. The dictator, General Manuel Noriega, held the country in his iron grip. To the north, the United States watched, its leaders weighing the cost of action against the mounting threat posed by Noriega's regime. His alliance with drug cartels in defiance of U.S. influence had turned Panama into a powder keg. In Washington, D.C., the decision was made. President George Bush addressed the nation, his words firm and deliberate. Operation Just Cause would commence to restore democracy and safeguard American lives. Across military bases in the U.S. and beyond, thousands of soldiers prepared. From Navy SEALs to Delta Force operatives, each unit honed their focus for what lay ahead. This would not be an ordinary campaign, it was an operation cloaked in precision and urgency. As the sun dipped below the horizon on December 19th, the final hours before the operation began unfolded in tense silence. Soldiers checked their equipment under dim red lights, their minds racing through mission plans. In Panama City, civilians locked their doors, their hearts pounding with fear of the unknown. High above the Pacific, U.S. aircraft engines hummed as they approached their targets. The countdown to action had begun. The night would be remembered for its swift brutality. The first flashes of gunfire lit up the dark sky, and the streets of Panama erupted in chaos. This was no longer a city at peace, it was the epicenter of a conflict that would shape its destiny. For those involved, this was a moment of reckoning, a test of resolve in the face of uncertainty. In the weeks leading up to the invasion, Panama was a nation on edge. General Manuel Noriega, once a trusted ally of the United States, had become a thorn in its side. His regime was marked by corruption, oppression, and collusion with international drug cartels. For years, Noriega played a dangerous game, balancing his loyalty between superpowers during the Cold War. But by 1989, his defiance of the United States had become untenable. Economic sanctions crippled Panama, and diplomatic talks faltered. Tensions reached a breaking point when Panamanian forces killed an unarmed American Marine, Lieutenant Robert Paz. The incident shocked the American public and gave President George H.W. Bush the pretext to act. "We will not stand idly by while our citizens are threatened," Bush declared. The decision to launch Operation Just Cause was sealed. The military buildup began quietly but efficiently. Over 27,000 U.S. troops mobilized, joining the 13,000 already stationed in Panama. Army Rangers, Delta Force operatives, and Navy SEALs were briefed on their roles. Each mission was meticulously planned, from securing critical infrastructure to neutralizing Noriega's command centers. Meanwhile, intelligence operatives gathered the latest information, mapping out the dictator's movements and key PDF strongholds. In Panama, the atmosphere was grim. Civilians stocked up on essentials, fearing what might come. Noriega, aware of the impending storm, fortified his defenses and intensified propaganda. The air crackled with anticipation as the days ticked down. The world watched, waiting for the inevitable clash. December 19, 1989, marked the last quiet sunset Panama would see for some time. As twilight descended, U.S. forces moved into position. In the dense jungles and urban sprawls, soldiers prepared for the tasks ahead. Each unit had its targets, airports, communication hubs, and PDF headquarters. Silence reigned, broken only by the rustle of leaves and the faint hum of engines. The operation began with a coordinated assault on strategic locations. The 82nd Airborne Division parachuted into the darkness, their silhouettes barely visible against the star-strewn sky. At the same time, Navy SEALs approached Paitilla Airfield, tasked with disabling Noriega's personal aircraft. Their mission was critical, preventing the dictator's escape. In Panama City, the first explosions shattered the calm. Tocumen Airport, a key objective, erupted in fire and smoke as Rangers stormed the facility. The PDF scrambled to respond, but they were outmaneuvered and outgunned. In the chaos, civilians cowered in their homes, the thunder of combat shaking the walls around them. Across the city, the streets turned into battle zones. Soldiers and vehicles moved with precision, clearing obstacles and securing positions. The operation was swift but intense. For the soldiers, it was a night of adrenaline and focus. For the people of Panama, it was a night of terror and uncertainty. The seizure of Tocumen Airport was a defining moment in the early hours of Operation Just Cause. The airport, the largest in Panama, served as a critical hub for the regime's logistics and a potential escape route for Manuel Noriega. Its capture would deny the Panamanian Defense Forces, PDF, a strategic advantage and secure an essential entry point for U.S. reinforcements. As the Rangers descended from the skies, the glow of the city lights below gave way to flashes of gunfire. The PDF, though caught off guard, mounted a fierce defense. Heavy machine guns rattled in the distance, and tracer rounds illuminated the night like fireflies. The Rangers, well-trained and heavily equipped, advanced with precision, clearing each building and securing the airfield. Within hours, the U.S. flag flew over Tocumen. The airfield's control tower, once a symbol of the regime's authority, now served as a command post for U.S. forces. Civilians working at the airport were rounded up and questioned, while soldiers established defensive perimeters. The airstrip became a lifeline for the operation, facilitating the arrival of additional troops and supplies. For the civilians living near the airport, the sound of aircraft and gunfire was overwhelming. Families huddled in basements, their prayers mingling with the echoes of war. Tocumen's capture was a tactical success for the U.S., but for the people of Panama, it marked the beginning of a long and uncertain ordeal. While the Rangers secured Tocumen, another critical mission unfolded at Paitilla Airfield, located just outside Panama City. Intelligence suggested that Noriega's personal Learjet was stationed there, ready for a swift escape. The task of disabling the aircraft fell to a team of Navy SEALs, renowned for their expertise in covert operations. Under the cover of darkness, the SEALs approached the airfield by boat. Their movements were swift and silent, their black uniforms blending seamlessly with the night. As they reached the perimeter, they encountered unexpected resistance. PDF soldiers patrolled the area, their numbers greater than anticipated. A firefight erupted, shattering the quiet with the staccato of automatic weapons. The SEALs pressed forward despite the odds. Amid the chaos, they reached the Learjet and rendered it inoperable, ensuring Noriega's flight was no longer an option. However, the mission came at a heavy cost. 4 SEALs lost their lives, and several others were wounded. The bravery and sacrifice of these men would be etched into the operation's history. By dawn, Paitilla Airfield was under U.S. control, but the price of victory was a stark reminder of the operation's gravity. As the sun rose, the sight of the disabled Learjet and the fallen SEALs cast a somber shadow over the day's triumphs. In the heart of Panama City lay El Chorrillo, a densely populated neighborhood that became a flashpoint in the conflict. Known as a stronghold of Noriega's supporters, the area was strategically significant and symbolically tied to the regime. U.S. forces moved into El Chorrillo with caution, aware that the streets would not easily yield. The initial assault was met with stiff resistance. PDF soldiers, embedded within the neighborhood, used the maze-like streets and alleys to their advantage. Snipers perched on rooftops, and barricades blocked key access points. For the U.S. troops, navigating the urban terrain was a harrowing experience. Each corner and doorway posed a potential threat. Civilians found themselves trapped in the crossfire. Fires broke out as explosions rocked the neighborhood, spreading quickly among the tightly packed buildings. Families fled with whatever belongings they could carry, seeking refuge in churches and schools. The smoke-filled air carried the cries of the wounded and the desperate. Despite the challenges, U.S. forces gradually gained control of El Chorrillo. By the end of the day, the PDF presence had been neutralized. However, the human cost was immense. The neighborhood lay in ruins, and countless lives were shattered. The devastation of El Chorrillo became one of the most controversial aspects of the invasion, raising questions about the operation's impact on innocent civilians. Fort Amador stood as a symbol of Panamanian military strength and a key defensive position guarding the Pacific entrance to the Panama Canal. The sprawling base, surrounded by dense tropical vegetation, housed significant PDF forces. For U.S. planners, its capture was critical to ensuring the canal's security and dismantling Noriega's stronghold. In the pre-dawn hours of December 20th, U.S. forces launched their assault. A combined force of infantry, armored units, and special operations teams moved swiftly, coordinating strikes on the fort's defenses. Apache helicopters hovered overhead, their rotor blades slicing through the humid air as they provided covering fire. PDF troops mounted a determined defense. Artillery positions roared to life, and sporadic gunfire erupted from bunkers hidden in the jungle. Yet, the superior training and firepower of the U.S. forces soon overwhelmed them. Rangers cleared buildings one by one, while engineers worked to neutralize booby traps and mines scattered across the base. By mid-morning, Fort Amador was under U.S. control. Its strategic importance as a gateway to the canal and a symbol of Noriega's regime was neutralized. The victory came with a somber acknowledgement of the lives lost on both sides. As soldiers raised the American flag over the fort, the quiet realization set in that the operation was far from over. With key installations falling one by one, attention shifted to the operation's ultimate objective, the capture of Manuel Noriega. Intelligence reports placed him in Panama City, but his exact location remained a mystery. Noriega, a master of evasion, had gone underground, leveraging loyalists and his intimate knowledge of the city's labyrinthine streets to avoid detection. U.S. forces intensified their efforts, establishing roadblocks and conducting house-to-house searches. Psychological operations played a crucial role. Leaflets offering rewards for information on Noriega's whereabouts were distributed, and radio broadcasts urged his surrender. The Panamanian people, caught between fear of retaliation and hope for liberation, began whispering of the dictator's movements. Meanwhile, Noriega's allies started to crumble. Senior PDF officers were captured or defected, leaving the dictator increasingly isolated. His once loyal inner circle now saw him as a liability. As the net tightened, reports emerged of Noriega seeking refuge in the Vatican embassy. It was a bold move, leveraging diplomatic immunity in a bid to escape the long reach of U.S. forces. The hunt for Noriega became a tense game of cat and mouse. Each passing hour brought new leads and fresh frustrations. For the soldiers on the ground, it was a race against time, a high-stakes mission to bring a tyrant to justice before he could slip away. The focus now shifted to the Vatican embassy, where Noriega had indeed sought sanctuary. While international law protected the embassy from direct military assault, U.S. forces devised a creative strategy to pressure the dictator into surrender. The operation, codenamed Nifty Package, was as unconventional as it was effective. Speakers were set up around the embassy, blasting rock music at deafening volumes. Songs like Welcome to the Jungle and We're Not Gonna Take It became the soundtrack of Noriega's confinement. The psychological warfare, designed to disrupt his mental state, attracted international attention and mixed reactions. Inside the embassy, Noriega's options dwindled. Cut off from his supporters and surrounded by U.S. forces, he faced mounting pressure. Food and supplies were restricted, and diplomatic negotiations faltered. Days turned into a grueling standoff, with the dictator's resolve slowly eroding. By January 3, 1990, the relentless psychological and tactical pressure succeeded. Noriega emerged from the embassy, hands raised in surrender. The once feared strongman was escorted to a U.S. military base, marking the end of his reign. For the soldiers who had pursued him, it was a moment of triumph and relief, the culmination of weeks of relentless effort. With Noriega captured, Operation Just Cause officially concluded. Panama City lay in a fragile calm, the echoes of gunfire replaced by the hum of reconstruction efforts. U.S. forces worked to restore order, assisting with humanitarian relief and rebuilding key infrastructure. For many Panamanians, the sight of foreign soldiers in their streets was bittersweet, a mix of liberation and loss. International reactions were polarized. While some hailed the operation as a decisive stand for democracy, others criticized the heavy-handed tactics and civilian casualties. El Chorrillo, now a smoldering ruin, became a stark symbol of the operation's human cost. Questions about the legality of the invasion lingered, fueling debates in diplomatic circles. For the soldiers, the end of the mission brought a mix of pride and introspection. Medals were awarded, but memories of the fallen weighed heavily. Many would carry the scars of the operation, both physical and emotional, long after they returned home. As Panama began its journey toward recovery, the legacy of Operation Just Cause took root. It was a story of military precision, resilience, and sacrifice, a complex chapter in the history of both nations. In the days following Noriega's capture, Panama began to awaken from the nightmare of war. Streets littered with debris and burnt-out vehicles told the story of intense urban combat. El Chorrillo, the neighborhood worst hit during the fighting, was a shell of its former self. Entire families had been displaced, and survivors scavenged through the rubble for remnants of their lives. U.S. forces coordinated humanitarian aid, distributing food and medical supplies to affected communities. Doctors treated the wounded, while soldiers helped clear streets and rebuild shelters. Despite these efforts, resentment simmered among many Panamanians. The heavy-handed tactics of the invasion, particularly the destruction of civilian areas, left deep wounds that would take years to heal. The Panamanian Defense Forces, PDF, were formally disbanded, and their leaders faced trials for war crimes and corruption. The new government, led by Guillermo Endara, struggled to assert control. As the country grappled with its newfound freedom, the scars of war remained visible in every corner of the nation, a constant reminder of the cost of liberation. For the U.S., victory came with its own set of challenges. While the operation achieved its objectives, it sparked global controversy. Critics questioned the legality of the invasion and its impact on Panama's sovereignty. Yet, for the soldiers who had fought, their mission was clear: they had brought an end to Noriega's reign of terror. Manuel Noriega, now a prisoner of the United States, was flown to Miami to face justice. The once feared dictator entered an American courtroom, his military uniform replaced by prison attire. Charged with drug trafficking, racketeering, and money laundering, Noriega stood as a stark symbol of power's fragility. The trial captured international attention. Witnesses testified about Noriega's ties to the Medellin cartel, his brutal suppression of dissent, and the web of corruption that had defined his rule. Prosecutors painted him as a criminal mastermind, while his defense team argued that he was a scapegoat in a larger geopolitical game. In 1992, Noriega was convicted on multiple charges and sentenced to 40 years in federal prison. The verdict marked the end of his journey from a CIA asset to an international pariah. For Panamanians, it was a moment of closure, though the wounds left by his regime would take generations to heal. Noriega's trial also reignited debates about the U.S. role in supporting authoritarian regimes during the Cold War. The same government that had once propped him up was now bringing him down. It was a lesson in the complexities of international politics, a reminder that allies could quickly become adversaries. With the PDF dismantled and Noriega behind bars, Panama faced the monumental task of rebuilding. The new government faced immediate challenges: restoring public trust, rebuilding infrastructure, and fostering economic stability. International aid poured in, but the scars of the invasion ran deep. One of the government's first acts was to establish a truth commission to investigate human rights abuses under Noriega's rule. Survivors shared harrowing accounts of torture, disappearances, and extrajudicial killings. The commission's findings were a painful but necessary step toward reconciliation. Economic recovery was slow but steady. The Panama Canal, a critical artery of global trade, became a focal point of national pride and economic revitalization. By the early 2000s, Panama had regained a sense of stability, though challenges remained. The memories of the invasion and the sacrifices it entailed became an integral part of the nation's identity. Panamanians commemorated the invasion with mixed emotions. For some, it was a necessary liberation; for others, a bitter reminder of foreign intervention. The duality of these perspectives underscored the complexity of Panama's journey toward healing. For the soldiers who participated in Operation Just Cause, the experience remained etched in their memories. Many returned home to ticker-tape parades and medals, but the psychological toll of combat lingered. Stories of courage, sacrifice, and camaraderie emerged as veterans shared their experiences. Specialist James Carter, a ranger who parachuted into Tocumen Airport, recalled the intensity of the firefight and the camaraderie that kept his unit going. "We were a family out there," he said in an interview years later. "Every step we took together." Meanwhile, Navy SEAL John Alvarez reflected on the loss of his comrades during the raid on Paitilla Airfield. "They gave their lives for the mission, for something bigger than all of us," he said, his voice heavy with emotion. For many veterans, the invasion was a defining moment in their lives, shaping their perspectives on war and its consequences. The operation also sparked broader discussions within the U.S. military. Lessons learned from the urban combat and coordination of special operations would inform future campaigns. Yet, for those who fought, the true measure of their actions was found not in strategy or tactics but in the lives forever changed by their mission. The story of Operation CARLOTA. In the shadow of the Cold War, a new battleground emerged on the African continent. Angola, rich in resources and riddled with strife, became a theater for ideological warfare. The Cuban intervention in Angola, spanning from 1975 to 1991, was a vivid tapestry of solidarity, sacrifice, and strategy. This story unfolds the Cuban journey, weaving their hopes, hardships, and heroics into the larger fabric of Angolan liberation. The year was 1975, and Angola stood at a precipice. After centuries of Portuguese rule, the Alvar Agreement was supposed to usher in peace and independence. Instead, it gave way to chaos. Three factions, the MPLA, UNITA, and FNLA, vied for control, each backed by international forces. Thousands of miles away in Havana, Fidel Castro received reports of South African incursions into Angola. For Cuba, Angola represented more than geopolitics, it was a call to uphold solidarity with a fellow liberation movement. Quietly, preparations for Operation Carlota began. On November 5, 1975, the first Cuban soldiers landed in Luanda. They were met not with fanfare but urgency. The MPLA was struggling to hold the capital against advancing FNLA forces backed by Zaire. Amid the oppressive heat and uncertainty, Cuban commanders set to work, organizing defenses and building alliances with local leaders. Among them was Raúl Menéndez, a young medic, who wrote home about the stark realities of war and the resilient spirit of the Angolan people. The sun had barely risen on November 10 when the earth trembled under the weight of artillery fire. At Quifangando, Cuban forces stood shoulder to shoulder with MPLA troops, holding back a fierce FNLA assault. This battle, won against all odds, marked a turning point. It proved the effectiveness of Cuban military expertise and bolstered the morale of their Angolan allies. For Lieutenant José Ortega, it was his baptism by fire, a harrowing initiation that forged unbreakable bonds with his comrades. As the scale of the conflict widened, so did Cuba's commitment. By early 1976, thousands of troops, doctors, and engineers had arrived in Angola. Ships carried not only weapons but also school supplies and medical equipment. While the soldiers engaged in battle, Cuban educators began teaching children in makeshift classrooms. Marta Alvarez, a teacher from Santiago de Cuba, chronicled her journey in letters, marveling at the courage of Angolan students eager to learn despite the ongoing war. In the southern provinces, the shadow of apartheid loomed large. South African forces, heavily armed and relentless, aimed to crush the MPLA. Cuban troops were dispatched to the region, embarking on grueling treks through dense jungles and arid plains. Commander Leopoldo Sintra Frias led the charge, his tactical brilliance matched only by his empathy for the suffering communities they encountered. Meanwhile, stories of Cuban valor began spreading, inspiring both allies and skeptics. The dense Angolan jungle was both ally and adversary. For Cuban troops, navigating this unforgiving terrain was a test of endurance. The humidity clung to their skin, insects tormented their every step, and rivers teemed with dangers. Yet, amidst these hardships, they forged connections with the local population, learning survival techniques and gaining invaluable allies. Captain Luis Martinez, a logistician, spearheaded the effort to transport supplies through treacherous pathways, his ingenuity ensuring the troops stayed equipped even in the most isolated outposts. In this environment, moments of humanity shone through. Stories emerged of Cuban medics treating injured Angolan civilians and soldiers alike, offering care that transcended language barriers. For Private Elena Rodriguez, the laughter of children playing in the village they had just protected was a rare reprieve from the ever-present tension. Named after an enslaved African woman who led a rebellion in Cuba, Operation Carlota symbolized resistance against oppression. By late 1976, Cuban forces had fully entrenched themselves alongside MPLA troops, conducting coordinated strikes against UNITA and South African positions. The operation was not without its costs. Casualties mounted as the enemy deployed sophisticated weaponry and tactics. One such skirmish near Casinga became a defining moment for young soldier Manuel Ruiz. Barely 19, Manuel had joined the mission with dreams of heroism but soon learned the brutal reality of war. His letters home captured the harrowing details: friends lost in ambushes, the terror of incoming fire, and the quiet resolve to push forward despite it all. While soldiers fought on the ground, the Cuban mission in Angola also waged a war of ideas. To Havana, this was not merely a military endeavor but a moral imperative against imperialism. Radio broadcasts, pamphlets, and speeches from Fidel Castro himself echoed across the island and beyond, portraying the Angolan struggle as an extension of Cuba's own fight for independence. Angolan civilians, too, became part of this ideological tapestry. In one instance, a young Angolan named Marta found herself inspired by Cuban teachers who spoke passionately about unity and progress. Her story became emblematic of the quiet but profound influence Cuban culture had on local communities. Education, music, and shared dreams of a better future transcended borders. South African forces intensified their operations in 1977, employing air raids and covert tactics to disrupt Cuban and MPLA supply lines. In one such raid on Lubango, Cuban anti-aircraft teams scrambled to protect strategic installations. The skies lit up with tracer rounds, and the deafening sound of explosions reverberated through the valley. Colonel Javier Perez, overseeing defenses in the region, described the moments after the attack as eerily silent. Amid the devastation, the resolve to hold their ground only deepened. Meanwhile, Cuban engineers worked tirelessly to repair damaged infrastructure, their work often carried out under the threat of renewed attacks. By the late 1970s, the Cuban and Angolan forces had become a single, cohesive unit. Joint training exercises and shared hardships fostered an unbreakable camaraderie. Soldiers swapped stories and traditions, bridging cultural divides. For Sergeant Rosa Vega, her newfound friendship with an Angolan fighter named João reminded her of why she had left her family behind, to stand against injustice and help others rise. However, the weight of the war grew heavier with each passing day. Letters from home spoke of families struggling in Cuba due to the economic strain of the mission. Soldiers carried these burdens silently, knowing their sacrifices were shaping history. The Cuban intervention in Angola was not an isolated event but a chess piece on the Cold War board. By 1978, international scrutiny intensified as the Soviet Union and the United States funneled support to their respective allies. Cuban soldiers on the ground often wondered if their struggles were pawns in a larger, unspoken game. Yet, for them, the mission was deeply personal, protecting Angola from imperialist forces and ensuring the survival of its fledgling government. Amid the geopolitical tension, General Arnaldo Ochoa worked tirelessly to maintain the morale and focus of his troops. He reminded them of Cuba's own revolutionary struggles, drawing parallels between Angola's fight and their victory over Batista decades earlier. His fiery speeches renewed their determination, even as whispers of superpower politics reached their ears. In 1983, the small town of Kangamba became a flashpoint in the conflict. A detachment of Cuban and MPLA forces found themselves surrounded by UNITA troops armed with sophisticated South African weaponry. For weeks, they endured relentless shelling, dwindling supplies, and the oppressive heat of the dry season. Lieutenant Pablo Morales, one of the defenders, described the siege in his journal. Each day feels like a lifetime. We fight not just for our lives but for the dignity of Angola and Cuba alike. The turning point came when Cuban reinforcements arrived, breaking the siege in a dramatic counteroffensive. The victory came at a heavy price, with hundreds wounded or killed, but it demonstrated the unwavering resolve of Cuban forces. War often brings destruction, but in Angola, Cuban intervention also brought hope. Cuban doctors, nurses, and teachers worked tirelessly to rebuild communities devastated by the conflict. Clinics sprang up in remote villages, and vaccination campaigns reached thousands. Marta Alvarez, the teacher from Santiago de Cuba, now led literacy programs in Wambo, teaching young Angolans to read and write despite the constant threat of attack. Her efforts resonated deeply with local leaders. Cuba did not just send soldiers, one Angolan elder remarked. They sent brothers and sisters who shared in our pain and helped us dream of peace. These small victories on the humanitarian front provided a glimmer of hope amid the chaos of war. By 1987, the conflict reached a pivotal moment at Cuidaquanavale. South African forces launched a massive offensive to capture the town, aiming to cripple the MPLA and secure a strategic advantage. Cuban reinforcements arrived in waves, bolstering Angolan defenses with artillery, tanks, and seasoned commanders. The battle quickly became a test of endurance and strategy. Cuban artillery officer Major Ramon Estrada coordinated defensive strikes with precision, often working through sleepless nights under the constant barrage of enemy fire. "Every inch of ground here feels sacred," he wrote to his wife. "We defend it not just for Angola, but for every oppressed nation that looks to us for strength." As the months dragged on, the Battle of Cuidaquanavale became a symbol of resistance. Cuban and Angolan forces, outnumbered and outgunned, held their ground against repeated South African assaults. The arrival of MiG fighter jets from Cuba tipped the scales, providing crucial air support to ground operations. By early 1988, South African forces began to retreat. This victory was more than military, it was ideological. For Angola, it was a step closer to sovereignty. For Cuba, it was proof of their commitment to solidarity. And for the soldiers who fought, it was a moment to reflect on their sacrifices and their place in history. The story of Operation Overlord. The year was 1974, and the air over Rhodesia was heavy with tension. The Rhodesian Bush War had reached a boiling point, with guerrilla forces advancing steadily toward the nation's heart. Amid this turmoil, Operation Overlord was conceived, a desperate and controversial bid by the Rhodesian government to sever the lifeline of support between insurgents and the rural civilians who sustained them. The operation would leave a lasting imprint on the land and its people, its echoes reverberating long after the dust of war had settled. The Chiwesh Tribal Trust land stretched out under the blazing African sun, its red earth marked by centuries of tradition. Life here was simple but connected to a deeper cultural rhythm. Families tended to their crops, children played under the shade of ancient baobabs, and elders shared wisdom around flickering fires. Yet, these tranquil days were increasingly pierced by whispers of conflict. Guerrilla fighters of the Zimbabwe African National Liberation Army, ZANLA, had begun moving through the area, seeking shelter, food, and allies. The Rhodesian government, led by Ian Smith, saw the region as a strategic threat. Reports of insurgents receiving aid from locals grew more frequent. Fearful of a broader uprising, the government enacted measures of collective punishment in 1973, hoping to quell the unrest. Entire villages were fined, crops destroyed, and livestock confiscated, but these harsh tactics only deepened the people's resentment. In early 1974, intelligence warned of a potential ZANLA advance toward Salisbury, the Rhodesian capital. The decision was made: Operation Overlord would forcibly relocate the 49,960 residents of Chiwesh into protected villages. These fortified settlements, it was claimed, would safeguard the population and isolate the insurgents. In reality, they aimed to break the bonds between guerrillas and their civilian supporters. For many residents, the announcement came like a thunderclap in a clear sky. Soldiers and police officers marched into villages with orders to clear them out. Women clutched their children, men argued futilely, and elders looked on with eyes heavy with sorrow. No one would be spared, every home would be dismantled, every field abandoned. On the dawn of July 27, 1974, the operation began. Trucks and armored vehicles rolled into Chiwesh, their rumbling engines breaking the morning silence. Soldiers dismounted swiftly, their faces unreadable as they delivered the same terse command: gather your belongings. You are being relocated. Families scrambled to collect their possessions, a meager pile of blankets, tools, and cooking pots. The young and the old were packed into military transports, while their homes were set ablaze behind them. Smoke curled into the sky, a harbinger of the destruction that would sweep the land. Among those forced to move was Jekasai, a mother of 3. She had heard rumors of the relocations but never imagined they would reach her village. As her children clung to her, wide-eyed and terrified, she tried to calm them with a trembling voice. Nearby, an elderly man named Tendai was helped onto the truck by his grandson, his gaze fixed on the horizon, where his ancestors' graves lay. The convoys moved slowly, escorted by armed guards. Tension filled the air, as if even the land protested this upheaval. Along the route, soldiers whispered among themselves, uneasy about their mission. Some believed it was a necessary evil, others questioned what they were truly protecting. The protected villages were anything but welcoming. Surrounded by barbed wire and watchtowers, they resembled prison camps more than sanctuaries. Arriving families were given tools to construct new huts, told to salvage materials from their previous homes if they could. The work was grueling under the relentless sun, and tempers flared as frustrations boiled over. Sanitation facilities were almost non-existent, and clean water was scarce. Within days, illness began to spread. Children fell sick first, their weak cries echoing through the settlement. Despite the hardships, some residents found solace in unity. They shared stories, cooked together, and tried to rebuild a semblance of community. For the soldiers, life in the villages was equally grim. They were tasked with guarding the settlements, but they knew the insurgents were never far away. Night patrols were fraught with danger, as guerrillas attempted to infiltrate the camps or harass supply lines. The soldiers' unease grew with each passing day, the strain of their dual roles, protectors and enforcers, etched into their faces. While the northern villages in Chiwesh showed some willingness to comply with the forced relocations, mainly out of fear of Zanla reprisals, the southern regions resisted fiercely. These were proud communities that had weathered countless hardships, and they did not take kindly to being uprooted. When the soldiers arrived in the southern hamlets, they were met with angry protests. Women stood firm in the doorways of their homes, refusing to move. Men argued passionately, some brandishing tools and farm implements in defiance. The soldiers, under orders to avoid unnecessary violence, hesitated. It was a tense standoff that could erupt into chaos at any moment. Among the dissenters was Nyasha, a local teacher. She had spent years fostering education in the community and refused to abandon the school she had worked so hard to build. "This is our home," she told the commanding officer, her voice steady despite the fear in her heart. "You may take our bodies, but you will not take our spirit." Ultimately, force prevailed. Soldiers dismantled huts and herded residents onto trucks, their cries of protest drowned by the roar of engines. Some villagers scattered into the surrounding bush, preferring the uncertainty of the wilderness to the confines of the protected villages. For them, the war was no longer distant, it was now a fight for survival. The protected villages quickly became symbols of oppression. Every aspect of life was controlled. Armed guards patrolled the perimeters, and curfews were strictly enforced. Any attempt to leave the village without permission was met with harsh punishment. For Jekasai, life in the settlement was a daily struggle. Her children, once carefree, now bore the weight of their displacement. Food was rationed, and the meager portions left her family perpetually hungry. Disease spread rapidly, with little medical care available to stem the tide. Meanwhile, Tendai, the elderly grandfather, found solace in the small rituals of his past. Each evening, he would gather a handful of soil from the village's outskirts and murmur prayers to his ancestors. Though he was far from their graves, he believed they could still hear him. The soldiers stationed at the villages faced their own trials. Morale was low, and many questioned the ethics of their mission. Lieutenant Peter Moyle, a young officer, often found himself caught between duty and empathy. One night, he wrote in his journal, "We were sent here to protect, but all I see is suffering. Are we truly doing what's right?" Beyond the barbed wire of the protected villages, the Zanla guerrillas regrouped. The forced relocations had disrupted their operations, cutting off vital support from the civilian population. Yet, they adapted. Guerrilla leaders, including hardened veterans like Comrade Monash, began devising new strategies to counter the Rhodesian forces. Monash understood the importance of the people's trust. He and his fighters spread messages of hope, urging the displaced villagers to resist in any way they could. Some began smuggling food and information to the guerrillas, defying the Rhodesian authorities at great personal risk. The guerrillas also launched attacks on supply convoys heading to the protected villages, aiming to undermine the operation. These ambushes were swift and brutal, leaving the soldiers shaken and uncertain. For Monash, each victory was a step closer to reclaiming the land for the people. Despite their resilience, the guerrillas faced their own challenges. Supplies were scarce, and the constant threat of airstrikes kept them on the move. The war was taking its toll on everyone, blurring the lines between right and wrong, hero and villain. By mid-August, the relocations in Chewesh were complete. The last of the villages had been cleared, and the displaced population settled into their new, guarded lives. For a brief moment, the Rhodesian government celebrated what they considered a victory. Insurgent activities in the area had decreased significantly, and the military turned its attention to other regions. However, the cracks in the operation were already beginning to show. The protected villages were poorly equipped to handle the long-term needs of their inhabitants. Sanitation remained a major issue, and outbreaks of cholera and dysentery became common. The people's anger simmered just below the surface, threatening to erupt at any moment. For Lieutenant Moyle, the end of the relocation phase brought little relief. He spent his days overseeing patrols and his nights haunted by the faces of those he had displaced. One evening, he confided in a fellow officer, "We've built a cage, but we've also trapped ourselves in it. How long can this hold before it breaks?" The villagers, too, began to adapt. Nyasha, the teacher, started holding classes in secret, using scraps of paper and charcoal for lessons. Jekasai worked tirelessly to care for her children, determined to give them a sense of normalcy despite their dire circumstances. Tendai continued his prayers, his faith a beacon of hope in a dark time. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the protected villages fell into uneasy silence. Curfews were strictly enforced, but within the cramped and poorly lit huts, whispers of defiance grew. Stories of resistance and survival circulated among the villagers, fueling their resolve to endure. One night, under the cover of darkness, a group of villagers attempted to escape. Among them was Nyasha, the teacher who had vowed never to let her spirit be broken. She led the group, which included children, elders, and a few able-bodied men. They moved silently, their footsteps muffled by the soft earth. The guards were vigilant, but the villagers had learned their routines. Nyasha's group slipped past the watchtowers, their hearts pounding with fear and hope. They made for the bush, where they hoped to find shelter and, perhaps, the guerrillas who fought for their liberation. When the escape was discovered at dawn, the soldiers were thrown into chaos. Lieutenant Moyo, who had begun to sympathize with the villagers' plight, ordered a search. Yet in his heart, he hoped the escapees would find freedom. He knew that for every villager who fled, the fragile illusion of control imposed by Operation Overload began to crack. The escapees faced the vast, untamed wilderness with a mixture of dread and determination. They were not alone, they carried with them the collective memories of their ancestors, whose resilience had long been intertwined with this land. The journey was grueling. The children cried from hunger and exhaustion, and the elders struggled to keep up. Nyasha pushed them forward, her voice steady as she reassured the group. "We are free now," she whispered. "Every step takes us closer to hope." As they ventured deeper into the bush, they encountered a band of Zanla guerrillas. The fighters, initially wary, softened upon seeing the villagers' condition. Comrade Monash, the group's leader, welcomed them. He listened to their stories of displacement and suffering, his expression darkening with anger. The guerrillas provided food and guidance, but they also knew the dangers. The Rhodesian forces would not take the escape lightly. Patrols would be intensified, and the bush would become a battlefield once more. For Monash, the arrival of these villagers was both a blessing and a burden, proof of the people's resistance, but also a reminder of the stakes of their fight. In the protected villages, Lieutenant Moyo faced mounting pressure. The recent escape had drawn the ire of his superiors, who demanded tighter security measures. Yet Moyo's conscience weighed heavily on him. Each order he gave felt like a betrayal of the very people he had once vowed to protect. One evening, Moyo called his second-in-command, Sergeant Ndlovu, to his quarters. "What are we doing here, Ndlovu?" he asked, his voice filled with weariness. "Is this truly the way to win this war?" Ndlovu, a veteran soldier, hesitated. "We follow orders, sir. That's what we've always done. But, it's hard to see where the line is anymore." Moyo nodded, his thoughts far away. He began to consider actions that would have once seemed unthinkable, perhaps even aiding the villagers in subtle, unseen ways. He knew the cost of such choices but felt that remaining silent would cost him his soul. In the bush, Nyasha's group found a new sense of purpose. The guerrillas taught them survival skills, showing them how to navigate the land and avoid detection. Nyasha became a symbol of hope, her courage inspiring others to join their cause. Among the escapees was Tendai, the elderly man who had once clung to rituals as his only solace. Now, he became a voice of wisdom for the group. "The land remembers," he told them one evening as they rested by a fire. "It carries our pain, but it also holds our strength. We must draw from it." Meanwhile, Munash's fighters began launching coordinated attacks on Rhodesian supply lines. Each victory, no matter how small, felt like a triumph for the displaced and oppressed. Yet Monash knew the risks. Every battle brought retaliation, and every success made the villages more vulnerable to reprisals. Back in the protected villages, Jekasai continued her quiet defiance. She shared food with those who had less, organized small gatherings to keep morale high, and passed information to trusted allies. She knew her actions were dangerous, but she also knew that survival meant more than merely existing. As the Rhodesian forces intensified their efforts to suppress resistance, the protected villages became increasingly oppressive. Guards were doubled, and residents were subjected to regular searches and interrogations. The atmosphere grew heavy with fear and resentment. Lieutenant Moyo, now deeply conflicted, began to work discreetly against the operation's harshest measures. He ensured that food rations were distributed more evenly and turned a blind eye to small acts of defiance. Yet he knew his position was precarious. One misstep could cost him his life, or worse, the lives of those he sought to protect. Jekisai, too, found herself walking a dangerous path. Her efforts to maintain hope within the village did not go unnoticed. Suspicion fell on her, and she was summoned for questioning. As she stood before the commander, her heart raced, but her voice remained steady. "I am just a mother," she said. "I do what I must to keep my children alive." Outside the villages, the guerrilla campaign intensified. Munash's fighters struck with precision, their attacks sending shockwaves through the Rhodesian ranks. For the villagers, these victories were both a source of hope and a reminder of the price of resistance. As Operation Overload neared its conclusion in Chiwesh, the Rhodesian government launched a similar campaign in the Madzewa tribal trust lands, named Overload II. The forced relocation of 13,500 civilians into 8 protected villages mirrored the earlier operation, with the same brutal efficiency and devastating consequences. The residents of Madzewa had heard rumors of what had happened in Chiwesh, and many were prepared to resist. However, resistance was met with overwhelming force. Entire families were uprooted, their homes reduced to ash. The protected villages in Madzewa, like those in Chiwesh, were hastily constructed, offering little in terms of safety or comfort. Among the new wave of displaced villagers was Daniel, a young man who had worked as a cattle herder. Torn from his land and livelihood, he carried the weight of his family's survival on his shoulders. His journey to the protected villages was marked by silent defiance. Though he complied with the soldiers' orders, he vowed to one day reclaim the life that had been stolen from him. For Lieutenant Moyo, overseeing the expansion of the operation into Madzewa deepened his moral conflict. He saw the same patterns of suffering and resistance, the same unrelenting grip of oppression. It was as if the war had become a cycle, feeding on the lives of the people it claimed to protect. Life in the protected villages grew increasingly unbearable. Disease continued to spread, food was scarce, and the oppressive watch of armed guards created an atmosphere of constant dread. For the villagers, survival meant navigating a fine line between compliance and defiance. Jekisai, despite the threats against her, continued her quiet acts of resistance. She organized secret meetings to discuss ways to smuggle supplies to the guerrillas. These gatherings were fraught with danger, but they also gave the villagers a sense of purpose and solidarity. Meanwhile, the guerrillas stepped up their attacks, targeting Rhodesian patrols and supply routes. Munash's fighters became bolder, their operations increasingly sophisticated. Yet with each victory came a heavy price. Retaliatory strikes by the Rhodesian forces often left villages in ruins, and the toll on civilian lives mounted. For Daniel, now living in one of the Madzewa villages, the conflict was personal. He had witnessed the destruction of his home, the despair of his family. Each day in the protected village felt like a battle against despair, but he found strength in the small acts of defiance that connected him to others. Within the Rhodesian military, cracks began to appear. Officers like Lieutenant Moyo struggled to reconcile their duty with their growing sense of guilt. Among the rank-and-file soldiers, morale was low, and many questioned the effectiveness of the operation. Moyo's journal became his sanctuary, a place where he could pour out his thoughts without fear of reprisal. "We are winning battles," he wrote one night, "but we are losing ourselves. This war is breaking us all, piece by piece. The pressure from above was relentless. Moyo's superiors demanded results, fewer escapes, more control, and an end to guerrilla activity in the region. Yet he knew that the more they tightened their grip, the more resistance they would face. One day, Moyo received an order to carry out a punitive raid on a village suspected of harboring guerrillas. He hesitated, his conscience warring with his duty. Ultimately, he led the raid but ensured that the villagers were given a chance to flee before the operation began. It was a small act of rebellion, but one that carried immense personal risk. In the bush, the guerrillas continued to adapt. Monash and his fighters established a network of informants and supply lines that stretched across the region. The protected villages, once intended to isolate the insurgents, became sources of intelligence and resources for the resistance. Nyasha, the teacher, became a vital link in this network. Her escape had transformed her from a displaced villager into a key figure in the resistance. She used her knowledge of the protected villages to guide guerrillas in their operations, often at great personal risk. One night, she met with Monash to discuss a plan to infiltrate a supply convoy. "These people need hope," she told him. "They need to see that the enemy is not invincible." The plan was executed with precision. The convoy was ambushed, its supplies seized and distributed among the guerrillas and villagers. The attack sent shockwaves through the Rhodesian ranks, further straining their resources and morale. Back in the villages, the sense of unity among the displaced residents grew stronger. Despite the hardships, they found ways to support one another. Women shared food, elders told stories to keep the younger generation connected to their heritage, and men formed clandestine groups to resist the guard's authority. Jekasai and Daniel, though from different villages, became unlikely allies. Their paths crossed during one of the secret meetings Jekasai had organized. Together, they began to plan ways to smuggle messages and supplies to the guerrillas. For Daniel, the partnership was a lifeline. He had struggled to find his place in the protected village, but working with Jekasai gave him a sense of purpose. For Jekasai, Daniel's determination reminded her of the strength that could be found in even the most dire circumstances. Meanwhile, Lieutenant Moyo's quiet acts of defiance continued. He began leaking information about troop movements to trusted villagers, hoping to mitigate the damage caused by the military's operations. It was a dangerous game, but one he felt compelled to play. Within the confines of the protected villages, whispers of rebellion grew louder. Jekasai's quiet defiance had inspired others to take small but significant risks. Families smuggled food, passed messages, and even sabotaged the guard supplies. Daniel, working alongside Jekasai, became a key figure in this underground network. His knowledge of the terrain and ability to move unnoticed made him invaluable. Together, they coordinated with guerrilla fighters, ensuring that resources and intelligence flowed despite the Rhodesian military's watchful eyes. The guards grew increasingly suspicious, conducting more frequent searches and interrogations. One day, a young boy was caught attempting to smuggle a note out of the village. The soldiers demanded to know who had sent him, but the boy refused to speak. His silence was a spark, igniting a newfound resolve among the villagers. For Jekasai and Daniel, the risks were mounting. They knew it was only a matter of time before their activities were discovered. Yet they pressed on, driven by the belief that their struggle was part of something larger, a fight for freedom and dignity. Within the Rhodesian military, divisions were becoming apparent. Officers like Lieutenant Moyo quietly questioned the morality of their mission, while others remained steadfast in their belief that the operation was necessary to defeat the insurgents. Moyo's doubts deepened when he witnessed the aftermath of a punitive raid. Entire families had been displaced, their homes reduced to rubble. The sight of children scavenging for scraps in the ruins haunted him. That night, he wrote in his journal, "We claim to bring peace, but we leave destruction in our wake. How long can we sustain this?" His second-in-command, Sergeant Ndlovu, noticed the change in Moyo. "You're not yourself, sir," he said one evening. Moyo didn't respond. Instead, he handed Ndlovu a folded piece of paper containing information about a planned raid. "Get this to someone who can stop it," he said quietly. Ndlovu hesitated but eventually nodded. Moyo's small acts of rebellion went unnoticed by his superiors, but they did not go unnoticed by the villagers. Slowly, his name became known among those who resisted, not as an enemy, but as an ally. In the bush, Monash and his fighters prepared for a major offensive. Intelligence from the villages had revealed a vulnerable supply depot near one of the protected settlements. Taking it out would deliver a significant blow to the Rhodesian forces. Nyasha played a crucial role in the planning. Using her knowledge of the area, she helped Monash devise a strategy that minimized risks to the villagers. "The people are already paying the price for this war," she said. "We can't let them suffer more." The attack was launched under the cover of darkness. The guerrillas moved swiftly and silently, their actions coordinated like the movements of a well-rehearsed dance. The depot's defenses crumbled under the assault, and within hours, the site was reduced to smoking ruins. The success of the operation sent shockwaves through the region. For the villagers, it was a moment of triumph, a sign that the insurgents were not only surviving but striking back. For the Rhodesian forces, it was a wake-up call, exposing vulnerabilities they had tried to deny. The Rhodesian government responded to the depot attack with swift and brutal retaliation. Villages suspected of aiding the guerrillas were targeted, their residents subjected to interrogations, beatings, and, in some cases, execution. The air grew heavy with fear, and the once whispered defiance of the villagers began to falter. In the protected villages, Jekasai and Daniel worked tirelessly to keep the spirit of resistance alive. They knew the cost of their actions, but they also knew that surrendering would mean losing everything they had fought for. One night, Daniel approached Jekasai with an idea. "We need to send a message," he said. "Something that shows them we won't break." Jekasai hesitated, knowing the risks, but she agreed. Together, they planned an act of defiance that would rekindle hope among the villagers. Meanwhile, Moyo found himself under increasing scrutiny. His superiors questioned his decisions, and whispers of disloyalty began to circulate. Yet he continued to walk the fine line between duty and rebellion, determined to do what he could to mitigate the suffering he saw around him. Jekasai and Daniel's plan was simple but bold. Under the cover of darkness, they and a small group of villagers set fire to a supply shed within the protected village. The flames roared into the night, a symbol of defiance that could not be ignored. The guards were caught off guard, scrambling to contain the fire. By the time they succeeded, the shed was reduced to ashes, and its contents destroyed. The villagers watched from their huts, a spark of hope flickering in their eyes. The retaliation was swift. The guards rounded up several villagers, demanding to know who was responsible. Jekasai and Daniel remained silent, their faces betraying no hint of guilt. The guards' frustration grew, but they could not find the culprits. The act of defiance became a turning point. The villagers began to see themselves not as victims, but as participants in a larger struggle. Their unity strengthened, and their whispers of rebellion grew into murmurs, louder and more resolute with each passing day. The fire in the supply shed had done more than destroy material goods, it had ignited the spirit of the villagers. For the first time in months, they felt a sense of control, however small, over their lives. Stories of the act spread across the protected villages, and whispers of courage replaced murmurs of despair. Jekasai and Daniel remained cautious. Though they had avoided detection, the risks of being discovered weighed heavily on them. Yet they pressed on, organizing clandestine meetings to plan future acts of defiance. The villagers, emboldened by their courage, began contributing ideas and resources. Meanwhile, Lieutenant Moyo received news of the fire. He suspected the culprits but chose not to pursue them. Instead, he used the incident to argue for a change in strategy. "We're pushing these people to the edge," he told his superiors. "They're not breaking, they're becoming stronger." His words fell on deaf ears. For Moyo, the fire symbolized something he had long suppressed, the inevitability of resistance. He began to see his role not as an enforcer, but as a bridge between the oppressed and the oppressors, even if it meant risking everything. In the bush, Monash received news of the fire with quiet satisfaction. It was a reminder that the spirit of resistance could not be extinguished, even under the harshest conditions. He saw an opportunity to strengthen the connection between the guerrillas and the villagers. Monash sent a trusted lieutenant, Comrade Tawanda, to infiltrate the protected villages and establish direct communication with the underground network. Tawanda was young but resourceful, his sharp mind and easy charm making him an ideal operative. Tawanda's arrival in Jekasai and Daniel's village was a turning point. Using coded messages and secret rendezvous points, he began coordinating efforts to smuggle supplies and gather intelligence. The villagers, despite the risks, rallied behind him, their resolve growing stronger with each success. For Daniel, Tawanda's presence was a revelation. He learned guerrilla tactics, strategies for evasion, and the importance of unity in the face of adversity. Jekasai, too, found new strength in the alliance, her quiet leadership becoming more assertive with each passing day. One evening, during a routine patrol, Lieutenant Moyo encountered a figure moving stealthily near the village's perimeter. It was Tawanda, carrying a message meant for the guerrillas. Moyo raised his weapon but hesitated. There was something about the young man's defiance that struck a chord. "Who are you?" Moyo asked, his voice firm but not hostile. Tawanda stared at him, measuring his response. "Someone trying to survive," he replied. Moyo lowered his weapon, his mind racing. He knew he should report the encounter, but something held him back. Instead, he said, "Be careful. The guards aren't as forgiving as I am." Tawanda nodded, vanishing into the night. The encounter left Moyo shaken. For the first time, he felt the weight of his dual loyalties. He had sworn an oath to his country, but his conscience pulled him in another direction. The line between ally and enemy blurred, leaving him questioning where he truly stood. The growing defiance in the protected villages did not go unnoticed. The Rhodesian authorities, desperate to maintain control, ordered stricter measures. Guards were authorized to use harsher punishments, and entire families were held accountable for acts of rebellion. One morning, a young boy was caught passing a message to a guerrilla contact. The guards made an example of him, dragging his family into the square and subjecting them to public humiliation. The villagers watched in silence, their hearts heavy with anger and grief. For Jekasai and Daniel, the incident was a sobering reminder of the stakes. They mourned for the boy and his family, but they also knew they could not falter. "If we stop now," Jekasai said, "their suffering will be for nothing." In the bush, Monash and his fighters continued their campaign, launching targeted strikes against Rhodesian forces. Each success brought hope to the villagers, but it also escalated the violence. The cycle of retaliation and resistance showed no signs of breaking. As the war dragged on, cracks began to appear in the Rhodesian government's strategy. The protected villages, once seen as a solution, had become a symbol of failure. Reports of disease, malnutrition, and unrest painted a grim picture, undermining the government's claims of success. For Lieutenant Moyo, the tide was also turning. His superiors grew increasingly suspicious of his actions, questioning his loyalty. Yet he continued to walk the fine line between duty and rebellion, using his position to protect the villagers whenever possible. One night, Moyo received an anonymous note. It was from Tawanda, thanking him for his discretion in offering a truce. "We're not so different," the note read. "We both want this war to end." Moyo burned the note but kept its message in his heart. Meanwhile, Jekasai and Daniel intensified their efforts, coordinating with Tawanda to sabotage the guard's operations. Each act of defiance, no matter how small, felt like a step toward reclaiming their freedom. Operation Hurricane, a story of nuclear ambition. The world in 1952 was a landscape scarred by recent history, yet brimming with the ambitions of nations seeking to assert dominance. The echoes of World War II still reverberated in every corner of the globe. From the bustling streets of London to the vast deserts of Western Australia, there was a palpable sense of transition. The United States and the Soviet Union were locked in a bitter Cold War, and the threat of nuclear devastation loomed ominously over the world. Britain, once an empire on which the sun never set, was grappling with the realization that its prominence on the world stage was slipping. Amid this turbulence, a decision was made in the halls of Whitehall that would alter the course of British history. The resolve to create an independent nuclear deterrent was born, a testament to the nation's desire to maintain its stature as a global power. The specter of American isolationism and the unyielding spread of Soviet influence made this decision inevitable. To the architects of this ambition, the ability to wield atomic power symbolized not just military might but also technological prowess and independence. The early days of this venture were fraught with uncertainty. Britain's contribution to the Manhattan Project had been substantial, with its finest scientists collaborating on the creation of the first atomic bombs. However, the secrets shared during wartime unity had become closely guarded by post-war American administrations. The McMahon Act of 1946 severed the once cooperative relationship, leaving Britain to forge its path alone. This marked the beginning of an audacious project that would become a defining moment for the nation. In the quiet chambers of London's bureaucratic machine, a secret meeting convened in January 1947. The mission was clear: Britain must develop its nuclear arsenal. It was here that Lord Portal, William Penny, and a cadre of scientific visionaries laid the foundation for what would be known as high-explosive research. As these plans were set in motion, few could have predicted the challenges and triumphs that lay ahead. Britain was entering uncharted waters, and the journey would take them to a remote cluster of islands off the coast of Western Australia. The story of Britain's nuclear ambitions began long before the smoke of Hiroshima cleared the skies. During World War II, the country's brightest scientific minds had envisioned the destructive potential of splitting the atom. Under the code name Tube Alloys, the project aimed to harness this newfound power. Yet, resource constraints and the pressing demands of war led Britain to merge its efforts with the American Manhattan Project. It was a partnership that would yield incredible results, though the alliance was fleeting. Among those who contributed to the Manhattan Project were British physicists like Rudolf P. Ailes and Otto Frisch, whose theoretical calculations laid the groundwork for the bomb's design. Working alongside their American counterparts, they were driven not just by curiosity but by the urgent need to end a brutal war. Yet, as victory was declared in 1945, the shared vision disintegrated. Britain's hopes of post-war collaboration faded into disappointment as the United States chose to guard its atomic secrets. This betrayal only strengthened Britain's resolve. The leadership knew that in the atomic age, national security could no longer depend on alliances alone. It was time for the nation to reclaim its independence in the nuclear field. The appointment of William Penny as the project's scientific leader was pivotal. A quiet but determined man, Penny had witnessed the destructive power of nuclear weapons firsthand as an observer of the Hiroshima bombing. He returned to Britain with a singular focus, to ensure that his nation would never be left vulnerable. The vision for a British atomic bomb took shape in laboratories and factories scattered across the country. At Aldermaston, a once quiet village in Berkshire, scientists and engineers worked tirelessly. The task was monumental, designing an implosion-type plutonium bomb capable of rivaling those of the United States and Soviet Union. Every breakthrough brought them closer to their goal, and every setback reminded them of the stakes. In the distance, the Montebello Islands awaited their place in history. As Britain's nuclear aspirations solidified, the shadow of World War II began to fade into the past, but its lessons remained firmly etched in the minds of policymakers. The United States, once Britain's steadfast ally, had turned inward, retreating into a policy of isolationism in the late 1940s. The Quebec Agreement, which had once fostered cooperation between British and American scientists during the war, was now a distant memory. The U.S. government, under President Truman, had closed its doors to Britain's nuclear ambitions, and the British government was left with the daunting task of forging ahead without their support. The betrayal was not merely political, it was deeply personal for the scientists involved. Many had worked side by side with American counterparts, sharing ideas and discoveries that had ultimately led to the creation of the atomic bomb. Now, in the wake of the war, Britain found itself isolated, a nation determined to hold on to its place in the world but without the means to defend that claim. The message was clear: if Britain wanted to retain any semblance of power, it had to secure its own nuclear deterrent. In response to this new reality, British officials resolved to build their own bomb, one that would be tested and perfected far from prying eyes. The political ramifications were immense. Nuclear weapons meant far more than military might. They were a symbol of power, influence, and national prestige. As plans were drawn up, British scientists worked in secret, knowing that success was crucial not only for the country's security but for its very identity as a global power. The decision to go it alone had been made, and there was no turning back. Yet, even in the isolation of post-war Britain, the global stage was shifting. The Soviet Union had tested its own atomic bomb in 1949, further fueling the Cold War rivalry. Britain's need for a nuclear weapon was now urgent. It was no longer just about maintaining status, it was about survival in an increasingly dangerous world. The government knew that to face the Soviet threat and to preserve its alliance with the United States, Britain needed to build the bomb as quickly as possible. In January 1947, the British cabinet set its course. The new project, dubbed High Explosive Research, aimed to develop nuclear weapons independently. It was under the direction of Lord Charles Portal, an experienced military leader, that the task of creating an atomic bomb was entrusted to a team of scientists and engineers. At the helm of the scientific side was William Penny, who had already earned his stripes as one of Britain's leading atomic experts. He had been instrumental in the early stages of the Manhattan Project and now faced the challenge of designing a bomb that could rival those of the United States and the Soviet Union. The work was meticulous and fraught with complications. Penny's team was small but dedicated, a mixture of military experts and civilian scientists who shared a singular goal. Their efforts were directed toward mastering the science of nuclear fission, which had been pioneered by scientists in the 1930s. The bomb they envisioned would be a plutonium-based implosion device, a design that had proven successful in the US bombs dropped on Japan but required perfect execution to avoid catastrophic failure. The stakes were high, and the pressure on Penny and his team grew with every passing day. The British government was deeply invested in the success of the project, seeing it not only as a military imperative but as a crucial step in reasserting Britain's influence on the world stage. The scientists worked under intense scrutiny, knowing that failure could have dire consequences for their careers, not to mention the safety of the nation. But they pressed on, driven by the knowledge that their success would place Britain among the world's nuclear powers, side by side with the United States and the Soviet Union. By 1949, the team had made significant progress. The designs for the bomb were complete, and Penny's team had already begun work on constructing a device capable of undergoing a full-scale test. Yet, there remained one critical challenge: where could the test be conducted in complete secrecy? The answer lay far from Britain's shores, in a remote and isolated part of the world, the Montebello Islands. Once the decision had been made to proceed with the nuclear program, the next obstacle was finding a suitable location for the bomb test. Britain, in its pursuit of nuclear power, found itself at a crossroads. The Pacific Proving Grounds in the United States, which had become the site of numerous atomic tests, was not an option. The US government had made it clear that Britain's involvement in future tests would be limited, a diplomatic stance that further drove Britain's desire for independence. In the aftermath of World War II, the global landscape had changed, and alliances were being redefined. Given the secrecy required, a new location had to be found. Canada was briefly considered, but political and logistical issues made it an unfeasible choice. This left Australia, a former colony of Britain and an ally in the Pacific theater during the war. After careful consideration, the Montebello Islands off the coast of Western Australia were selected as the site for Britain's first atomic bomb test. The decision was not made lightly. The Montebello Islands were far from the mainland, remote and largely uninhabited, offering the perfect location for a test that needed to remain shrouded in secrecy. Furthermore, the British government had a long-standing relationship with Australia, and securing the permission of Prime Minister Robert Menzies was essential. The negotiations were swift but delicate. Australia had just emerged from the horrors of the war, and the idea of hosting a nuclear test in its backyard raised serious questions about environmental and political repercussions. Ultimately, after some diplomatic maneuvering, Australia's government agreed to allow Britain to carry out the test. As the bomb was being constructed, a small fleet of Royal Navy ships was assembled to transport it to the Montebello Islands. At the helm was Rear Admiral A.D. Torles, who was tasked with overseeing the operation. His flagship, the HMS Campania, would lead the mission, accompanied by several other ships, including landing ships and tankers. Together, this naval fleet would carry the bomb to its destination in preparation for its historic detonation. The sun hung low over London in late 1950 as Britain's diplomatic corps prepared to engage its distant ally, Australia. The Montebello Islands, a remote archipelago off the coast of Western Australia, had been identified as the perfect location for the impending test. Yet, despite their desolation, the islands still fell under the jurisdiction of the Australian government. Securing their use would require careful diplomacy and a convincing argument for why this operation was essential to Britain's future and, ostensibly, to Australia's security as well. Robert Menzies, Australia's Prime Minister, was a staunch supporter of the British Commonwealth, but his government was not without its reservations. While the islands were sparsely populated, the potential risks to Australia's environment and international standing weighed heavily. In private meetings with British representatives, Menzies expressed concerns about fallout and public backlash. Still, he understood the significance of maintaining a close relationship with Britain, especially in the volatile geopolitical climate of the Cold War. The negotiations were deliberate, but by May 1951, an agreement had been reached. Australia would allow Britain to conduct its test on the Montebello Islands. In exchange, Australia sought assurances about safety and post-test cleanup, as well as access to the scientific findings that would emerge from the operation. For Menzies, it was a delicate balance, aligning with Britain's strategic goals while managing the expectations of his constituents. Back in Britain, the approval was hailed as a diplomatic victory. The Montebello Islands offered the isolation needed for secrecy, and their geographic location meant any fallout would likely dissipate harmlessly over the vast Indian Ocean. With the test site secured, preparations began in earnest. Britain was now one step closer to achieving its nuclear ambitions. The Royal Navy was called into action as the project shifted from planning to execution. Rear Admiral A.D. Torles was tasked with commanding a fleet assembled specifically for Operation Hurricane. This was no ordinary naval mission. Every ship and sailor involved would play a role in history, though the full scope of their task was shrouded in secrecy. At the heart of the fleet was HMS Campania, a versatile escort carrier that would serve as the operation's flagship. Accompanying it were several landing ship tanks, LSTs, including the HMS Narvik and HMS Zebra, which were transport equipment and personnel. Among the fleet's unique assets was HMS Plym, a frigate that would ultimately house the bomb itself. Each ship had a specific role to play, and the meticulous planning ensured that every detail was accounted for. The journey to the Montebello Islands was a monumental undertaking. Crews worked tirelessly to load supplies, scientific equipment, and the bomb itself, minus its radioactive core, which would be added at a later stage. The logistics of transporting such a device across vast ocean distances demanded precision. Every precaution was taken to ensure safety, yet the weight of their mission hung heavily on the fleet. As the ships departed British waters, the mood aboard was one of quiet determination. For many sailors, the true nature of their mission remained a mystery, but there was an unspoken understanding that this was no ordinary voyage. For Rear Admiral Torles and his officers, the responsibility was clear: deliver the bomb to its destination, and oversee its preparation for the ultimate test. While the Navy prepared for its mission, the scientific team behind Operation Hurricane faced its own challenges. At the forefront was Leonard Tite, a physicist from the Atomic Weapons Research Establishment at Aldermaston. Tite was appointed technical director for the operation, a role that placed him at the intersection of science, engineering, and military logistics. The task of designing and assembling the bomb was a collaborative effort, drawing on expertise from across Britain. Engineers and physicists worked side by side to refine the design, ensuring it would function as intended under the unique conditions of the test. At its core, the bomb was a plutonium-based implosion device, similar in design to the one used at Nagasaki. But the Hurricane test sought to explore a new dimension: the effects of an atomic explosion triggered within the hull of a ship. For Tite and his team, the stakes could not have been higher. The test would not only validate Britain's nuclear capability but also influence its strategic posture in the years to come. Days turned into nights as the team worked tirelessly, testing components and running simulations. Despite the pressure, there was an undeniable sense of camaraderie, a shared belief that their work was critical to Britain's future. As the bomb neared completion, the scientists prepared to join the fleet for its journey to the Montebello Islands. For many, it would be their first time stepping into the operational theater, far removed from the controlled environments of their laboratories. Yet, as they boarded their assigned ships, they carried with them the confidence born of years of meticulous preparation. The bomb, now complete save for its radioactive core, was transported under heavy security to HMS PLYM. The ship, a compact yet sturdy frigate, had been specially outfitted for its role in the test. Inside its hull, technicians installed the device, taking every precaution to ensure it remained stable during the long voyage ahead. The fleet's journey to the Montebello Islands was a test of endurance and coordination. Battling unpredictable weather and the sheer vastness of the Indian Ocean, the convoy advanced steadily toward its destination. The sailors, though accustomed to long deployments, were acutely aware that this mission was unlike any they had undertaken before. The secrecy surrounding their cargo only added to the sense of anticipation. As the fleet neared the islands, the Montebello archipelago came into view, a stark, barren landscape of rocky outcrops surrounded by crystalline waters. It was here, far from the eyes of the world, that Britain's nuclear future would be forged. Anchoring off the coast, the fleet began its final preparations, unloading equipment and establishing temporary facilities for the scientists and military personnel. The bomb's radioactive components, transported separately, were carefully assembled on site under the watchful eyes of both scientists and military officials. As the device took its final form, a sense of awe and trepidation settled over those involved. They knew that in the coming days, the world would witness the destructive power of human ingenuity, and that they would forever be part of this pivotal moment in history. The Montebello Islands, once quiet and unremarkable, transformed into a bustling hub of activity as the fleet anchored in the turquoise waters surrounding them. For sailors, scientists, and engineers alike, life on the islands was unlike anything they had experienced before. Temporary shelters were erected on the rocky terrain, and pathways carved through the scrubland connected the various operational zones. The islands, with their stark beauty and isolation, became a temporary home for those who would bear witness to history. The scientists, led by Leonard Tite, worked long hours under the sweltering sun. Every aspect of the test had to be meticulously prepared, from positioning the bomb aboard HMS PLYM to setting up the recording and measurement equipment that would capture the explosion's effects. For the sailors, duties ranged from logistical support to maintaining security, ensuring that no unauthorized individuals came near the test site. Despite the intense workload, camaraderie flourished. Shared meals and moments of levity brought the group closer, providing a sense of normalcy amid the extraordinary circumstances. The natural environment posed its own challenges. The island's arid conditions and limited resources required careful management of supplies. Freshwater was a precious commodity, and the extreme heat tested everyone's endurance. The isolation was both a blessing and a curse. While it provided the secrecy the operation required, it also left those involved with an acute awareness of their vulnerability in the event of an emergency. As the days turned into weeks, anticipation built steadily. The team knew they were part of something far greater than themselves, a milestone in Britain's journey as a nuclear power. Yet, beneath the excitement lay a quiet tension. The sheer destructive power of the bomb they had created was a constant reminder of the stakes at hand. In the final days before the test, the atmosphere on the islands grew tense. Every detail was scrutinized to ensure that nothing could go wrong. The bomb, now fully assembled, was secured in the hull of HMS PLYM, anchored 350 meters off the coast of Trimawheel Island. Technicians double-checked the device's components, while engineers calibrated the monitoring equipment that would record the explosion. Rear Admiral A.D. Torles and his officers held regular briefings, emphasizing the importance of safety and coordination. The operation involved not only detonating the bomb but also capturing data that would be critical for future tests. Cameras, pressure sensors, and other instruments were strategically placed to document the effects of the explosion on the ship, the water, and the surrounding environment. Among the scientists, there was a palpable mix of excitement and apprehension. For William Penny, who had overseen the project from its inception, this was the culmination of years of hard work and sacrifice. As he walked along the shores of the island, the weight of responsibility was etched into his face. He knew that the success of Operation Hurricane would secure Britain's place as a nuclear power, but the cost of failure was unthinkable. As the countdown approached, strict protocols were enacted. All personnel not directly involved in the detonation were ordered to retreat to designated safe zones. The fleet repositioned to maintain a safe distance, and the final checks were conducted under the cover of darkness. By the time the sun set on October 2, 1952, the stage was set for Britain's first atomic explosion. The night before the test was unnervingly quiet. The fleet lay still, and the waters surrounding the Montebello Islands reflected the moonlight in a serene yet foreboding tableau. For those aboard the ships and on the islands, sleep was elusive. Conversations were hushed, punctuated by the sound of waves lapping against the hulls of the anchored vessels. As dawn approached on October 3, the final countdown began. Scientists and military personnel gathered in observation posts, their faces lit by the faint glow of equipment monitors. Radios crackled with the voices of officers coordinating the operation, each word deliberate and calm. HMS PLYM, its silhouette barely visible in the dim light, stood as both the centerpiece and the sacrificial vessel of this historic event. The moment of detonation was set for 23:59 and 24 seconds Universal Time Coordinated. As the seconds ticked by, an eerie stillness settled over the scene. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. For those watching, time seemed to stretch, every heartbeat echoing with the gravity of what was about to occur. Across the miles of ocean separating the fleet from HMS PLYM, every eye was fixed on the spot where history would soon be made. And then, at precisely the appointed second, the silence was shattered. The explosion erupted with a force that defied comprehension. From HMS PLYM's hull, a blinding flash of light illuminated the darkened sky, followed by a thunderous roar that echoed across the islands and out to sea. A towering column of water, mud, and debris shot upward, forming the iconic cauliflower cloud that would come to symbolize the power of the atomic age. The shockwave rippled outward, rocking the ships of the fleet and sending vibrations through the very ground of the islands. In the observation posts, scientists and military officials scrambled to capture the data as the instruments registered the event. Cameras whirred, seismographs danced, and sensors recorded the immense heat and pressure unleashed by the bomb. As the mushroom cloud climbed higher into the atmosphere, it painted the sky with shades of fiery orange and gray. Onlookers watched in awe and trepidation, fully grasping the magnitude of what they had witnessed. The bomb had performed as intended, detonating 2.7 meters below HMS PLYM's waterline and leaving a crater 300 meters across on the seabed. For those present, the moment was both exhilarating and sobering. They had proven Britain's capability to harness the power of the atom, but the sheer devastation left no room for celebration. Operation Hurricane was a success, but it was also a stark reminder of the destructive force humanity had unleashed. The story of Operation Saffron. In the tumultuous southern reaches of Africa, the year 1979 bore the weight of simmering conflicts and fragile alliances. Among the arid plains and dense forests of Zambia, an operation known as SAFFRAAN unfolded, leaving its mark on a region already steeped in struggle. The story begins in the Caprivi Strip, where the winds carried whispers of war. Kadimo Mulilo, a quiet South African garrison town, were the scars of shelling by the People's Liberation Army of Namibia, PLAN. This act of aggression set into motion a retaliatory strike by the South African Defence Force, SADF, that would echo through the sands of history. The early morning sun cast long shadows over Katamomulilo, a town nestled along the eastern edge of Namibia. Children played near the Zambezi River, their laughter masking the tension that simmered among the town's adults. Weeks earlier, artillery shells had shattered the tranquility, leaving homes in ruins and fear etched into the hearts of its people. Captain Johan de Villiers stood on the garrison's observation tower, scanning the horizon with a practiced eye. The shelling had come without warning, a stark reminder of the volatile border shared with Zambia. Intelligence reports indicated that PLAN forces, with tacit support from the Zambian military, were massing across the border. Their base near Sinjambile was thought to be a hub of insurgent activity. Johan's orders were clear: retaliate decisively. In the days that followed, the garrison's quiet was replaced with a flurry of activity. Supplies were loaded onto trucks, soldiers checked their weapons, and commanders pored over maps. The mission, codenamed Operation SAFFRAAN, would be a coordinated strike into Zambian territory to dismantle PLAN's operational infrastructure. The stakes were high, and the consequences uncertain. On the night of March 6, 1979, a convoy of armored vehicles moved silently through the dense bush. The moonlight filtered through the foliage, casting eerie patterns on the ground. Leading the operation was Colonel Peter Erasmus, a veteran of numerous cross-border raids. His calm demeanor belied the weight of responsibility he bore. In the back of one vehicle sat Private Sifo Kumalo, a young recruit from Soweto. This was his first mission, and he clutched his rifle tightly, trying to quell the nervous energy coursing through him. Beside him, Sergeant Willem Botha whispered words of encouragement, drawing on years of combat experience to ease the rookie's fears. Focus on the mission, lad. Fear will only slow you down. As the convoy crossed into Zambian territory, the air grew thick with tension. Every rustle in the underbrush and distant animal cry felt amplified. The soldiers knew the terrain was as much an enemy as the PLAN fighters. The Njinj forest, vast and labyrinthine, was notorious for its ability to swallow men whole. Dawn broke over Sinjambile, revealing a sprawling PLAN base nestled among the trees. The South African forces moved swiftly, encircling the target before unleashing their assault. Mortar fire lit up the sky as soldiers advanced under the cover of smoke. Sifo stayed close to Sergeant Botha, following his lead as they cleared one structure after another. The PLAN fighters, though caught off guard, fought fiercely to defend their stronghold. Gunfire echoed through the forest, a cacophony of chaos and resolve. By midday, the base lay in ruins. Documents and weapons were seized, and what couldn't be carried was destroyed. The operation had been a success, yet the soldiers' faces bore no joy, only the grim satisfaction of duty fulfilled. Among the debris, Johan de Villiers found maps hinting at other PLAN installations deeper in Zambia. The mission was far from over. The aftermath of the raid brought new challenges. As the South African forces regrouped, they became acutely aware of their precarious position. Deep in enemy territory, every decision carried the risk of retaliation. Colonel Erasmus convened his officers to discuss their next move. Meanwhile, Sifo sat with a group of soldiers, sharing stories over a meager meal. For a moment, the camaraderie eased the weight of their situation. "Do you think we'll make it out of here?" he asked, voicing the fear that lingered in every heart. Willem's reply was steady. "One step at a time, Sifo. We're a team, and we'll get through this together." Unbeknownst to the soldiers, their movements had been observed. Deep in the forest, clan scouts relayed their position to higher command. The hunters were about to become the hunted. As twilight descended, the South African convoy hunkered down in a makeshift camp. The silence of the Njinj forest was both an ally and a menace. Colonel Erasmus, wary of a counterstrike, ordered sentries to keep vigilant watch. The soldiers, though physically drained, maintained their resolve. Meanwhile, clan forces were regrouping. The base's destruction was a significant blow, but their determination to defend their homeland outweighed their losses. In a hidden encampment not far from the South African position, Commander Elias Mwansa outlined an ambush plan. His sharp eyes scanned the map, noting the likely retreat paths. "We'll strike before dawn," he said with quiet confidence. Back at the South African camp, Sifo struggled to sleep. The dense forest seemed alive, every rustle a potential threat. Sergeant Botha sat beside him, sharpening his knife. "Rest, Sifo," he said. "You'll need your strength. The forest has ears, but fear makes them louder than they are." Sifo nodded, but his unease lingered. As the night wore on, a faint noise broke through the stillness, footsteps. The sentries signaled silently, and within moments, the camp was alert. Clan forces had arrived. The attack came swiftly and with precision. Clan fighters used the dense foliage to their advantage, striking hard and disappearing into the trees. Gunfire echoed as the South Africans retaliated, their training allowing them to adapt quickly. Colonel Erasmus barked orders, directing his men to hold their ground. "Do not scatter. They want us disorganized," he shouted over the cacophony. The soldiers formed a defensive perimeter, their disciplined response stemming the tide of the ambush. Sifo found himself in the thick of the fight, his nerves on edge. Beside him, Sergeant Botha returned fire with calm efficiency. "Steady, Sifo," he said. "Aim true. Panic is their weapon, not ours." As the sun broke over the horizon, the clan forces began to retreat. The ambush had inflicted casualties, but the South Africans had held their position. The forest fell silent once more, its shadows retreating with the dawn. The camp bore the scars of the ambush, damaged vehicles, scattered supplies, and the loss of comrades. Colonel Erasmus stood over a map, evaluating their next move. "We can't stay here," he said. "We press forward or risk being surrounded." Among the soldiers, the mood was somber. Sifo sat quietly, reflecting on his first real battle. "I didn't think it would be like this," he admitted to Willem. The sergeant placed a hand on his shoulder. "War never is, lad. But we fight for those who can't." As the convoy prepared to move, a scout returned with news: another clan base had been located deeper in the forest. Erasmus saw an opportunity to turn the tide decisively. Despite the risks, he gave the order to advance. The journey deeper into Zambia was fraught with challenges. The forest thickened, and the terrain became treacherous. The soldiers moved cautiously, their senses heightened. Every step brought them closer to their target and deeper into enemy territory. As they approached the coordinates, the scale of the clan base became apparent. This was no mere outpost, it was a hub of operations. Colonel Erasmus devised a plan to neutralize it without incurring heavy losses. Under the cover of night, small teams infiltrated the perimeter, planting charges on key structures. Among them was Sifo, whose fear had given way to determination. His hands trembled as he set the explosives, but Willem's steady presence gave him strength. At the break of dawn, the charges were detonated. The base erupted in flames, the South African forces retreating before planned fighters could mount a response. The mission was a success, but the victory came with a cost, a reminder of the weight of their actions. The destruction of the planned hub was a significant victory, but the South African forces knew their position was now exposed. Planned fighters, enraged by the assault, would not relent. Colonel Erasmus ordered an immediate retreat, charting a path back toward the border that avoided known trails. As the convoy navigated the dense forest, planned forces shadowed their movements. Scouts reported sightings of enemy patrols, and the soldiers braced for more ambushes. Supplies were dwindling, and exhaustion weighed heavily on every step. For Sifo, the retreat was a grueling test of endurance. His boots were caked with mud, and his rifle felt heavier with each passing hour. Willem remained by his side, offering quiet words of encouragement. "Every step is one closer to home, lad," he said. "Keep moving." The retreat took its toll, but discipline held the soldiers together. They moved as a unit, every man relying on the other. By the time they reached the relative safety of a temporary camp near the border, the forest had claimed its share of casualties. The camp was a hive of activity as medics tended to the wounded and officers planned the next phase. The soldiers, though weary, shared a moment of camaraderie. Around a small fire, they recounted stories of home, their voices tinged with longing. Sifo listened intently, his own thoughts turning to his family in Soweto. The war felt far removed from their lives, yet he knew they would be proud of his resilience. Willem handed him a cup of coffee. "You've done well, Sifo. Better than most on their first mission." Despite the relative calm, tension lingered. Colonel Erasmus knew the respite was temporary. Intelligence suggested that planned forces were regrouping for a final push to reclaim their lost ground. The South Africans needed to fortify their position and prepare for a decisive confrontation. As dawn broke, the camp was abuzz with preparations. Trenches were dug, machine guns positioned, and supplies rationed. Colonel Erasmus addressed the men, his voice steady and resolute. "We've come this far together. We hold the line here and show them what we're made of." The planned assault came as expected, a wave of fighters emerging from the forest with determination in their eyes. The South Africans met them with a wall of firepower, their defensive preparations paying off. The battle raged for hours, both sides sustaining heavy losses. Amid the chaos, Sifo found himself in the thick of the fight once more. His hands no longer trembled, and his aim was true. Willem's voice rang out beside him, a steady anchor in the storm. "Keep your head down and stay focused." As the sun dipped below the horizon, the planned forces began to withdraw. The South Africans had held their ground, but the cost was high. The battlefield was a grim tableau, a stark reminder of the human toll of war. The aftermath of the battle brought a somber stillness. Soldiers moved among the fallen, their faces etched with grief and exhaustion. The camp was quiet save for the crackle of fires and the distant calls of night birds. Sifo sat with Willem, staring into the flames. "Do you think it was worth it?" he asked softly. Willem took a long breath before answering. "I don't know, Sifo. Maybe one day we'll see the difference we made. For now, we just carry on." Colonel Erasmus wrote his report by lantern light, detailing the operation's successes and losses. Operation Saffron had achieved its objectives, disrupting planned operations and forcing their withdrawal from Zambia. Yet, he knew the war was far from over. As the soldiers prepared to return to the Caprivi Strip, they carried with them the scars of battle, physical and emotional. The forest had tested their resolve, but they had endured. The story of Operation Saffron would live on, a testament to the complexities of conflict and the resilience of those who lived through it. The convoy's arrival at the Caprivi Strip was marked by a subdued air. Soldiers who had entered the Zambian forests weeks earlier returned with hollow eyes and weary steps. The once pristine uniforms were now torn and stained, a reflection of the hardships they had endured. Colonel Erasmus addressed the garrison in a brief speech. "You have all fought with valor. The operation was a success, and the enemy has been disrupted. Yet, let us not forget those we lost. Their sacrifice will not be in vain." Saifo stood in the back of the gathering, his thoughts far away. The young recruit had entered the conflict wide-eyed, but now he felt older, his innocence chipped away by the harsh realities of war. Willem placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "You've done well, lad. But remember, surviving the battle is only half the fight. The rest is learning to live with it." For some, returning to the Caprivi felt like coming home. The garrison offered a semblance of stability, a place to regroup and reflect. Letters from family awaited many soldiers, bringing news of life outside the war zone. For Saifo, a letter from his younger sister was both a comfort and a pang of guilt. "We miss you," it read, "but we are so proud." Amid the relief of safety, tensions lingered. The officers held meetings to discuss the intelligence gathered during the operation. The captured maps and documents pointed to additional planned activity further north. The war was far from over, and the next mission loomed on the horizon. In the evenings, the soldiers gathered around fires, sharing stories and laughter to keep the darkness at bay. For Saifo, these moments of camaraderie were a lifeline. "It's strange," he said to Willem one night. "We're so far from home, but sometimes this feels like family." As the days turned to weeks, the garrison began preparing for the next phase of operations. Colonel Erasmus pored over the intelligence reports, identifying potential targets that could cripple Plan's ability to infiltrate the border. Among the soldiers, the mood was a mix of anticipation and apprehension. The successes of Operation Saffron had boosted morale, but the scars of battle were still fresh. Saifo spent his days in training, determined to improve his skills. "Next time," he told Willem, "I want to be ready for anything." Meanwhile, Plan forces were also regrouping. In the depths of Zambia, Commander Mwansa rallied his men, vowing to retaliate for the losses inflicted by the South Africans. "They think they've weakened us," he said. "But we are far from defeated." One afternoon, while on patrol near the Zambezi River, Saifo and his unit encountered a group of local villagers. The interaction was brief but humanizing, a reminder that life persisted beyond the war. A young boy offered Saifo a piece of fruit, and for a moment, the soldier saw himself in the child's wide, curious eyes. "Do you ever think about what it's like for them?" Saifo asked Willem as they walked back to camp. Willem nodded solemnly. "Every day. They didn't choose this war, Saifo. None of us did." That evening, as the sun set over the river, Saifo sat alone, reflecting on the encounter. The war had hardened him, but moments like these softened the edges. He vowed to hold on to them, even as the conflict dragged on. Word spread through the garrison of diplomatic talks taking place far from the front lines. Though the soldiers knew better than to hope for a swift resolution, the news sparked quiet discussions. "Do you think it'll end soon?" Saifo asked Willem. The sergeant shrugged. "Wars like this don't end easily. But every step toward peace is worth taking." As preparations for the next mission continued, the garrison received a shipment of new supplies and reinforcements. Among the fresh faces was Corporal Jacob Stein, a charismatic figure who quickly earned the respect of the men. "We've got a tough fight ahead," he said, "but we've proven we can handle it." For Saifo, the arrival of reinforcements was both a relief and a reminder of the cycle of war. New soldiers would face the same trials he had, their journeys just beginning. The intelligence gathered from Operation Saffron hinted at renewed clan activity near Sinjambil. This region, once a stronghold, was being re-established as a base for operations against South African forces. Colonel Erasmus saw this as an opportunity to strike decisively and prevent future incursions. In the garrison, preparations were underway. Maps were scrutinized, and patrols were sent to confirm the intelligence. Among the soldiers, whispers of a new mission spread quickly. Saifo felt a mix of dread and determination. "Do you think we'll make it back?" he asked Willem during a break. Willem, ever steady, replied, "We made it once. We'll do it again." As the convoy set off toward Sinjambil, the forest seemed even denser, its shadows deeper. The soldiers knew the terrain would be as much a challenge as the enemy. Every step was taken with caution, every noise a potential threat. Approaching Sinjambil, the South African forces encountered the first signs of resistance. Clan fighters had set up ambushes along the paths, forcing the convoy to halt and reassess. Colonel Erasmus ordered reconnaissance units to scout alternative routes while maintaining a defensive perimeter. The tension among the soldiers was palpable. Saifo gripped his rifle tightly, his eyes scanning the tree line. "Stay sharp," Willem reminded him. "This is their territory, but we're not here to lose." As night fell, the convoy moved cautiously under the cover of darkness. The plan was to launch a surprise assault at dawn, striking the planned base before they could regroup. Every soldier knew the risks, but they also understood the importance of their mission. When the first light of dawn crept over the horizon, the South African forces were in position. Mortar fire shattered the early morning stillness, signaling the start of the assault. The Plan fighters, though caught off guard, responded with fierce resistance. Saifo found himself in the heart of the battle, his training and instincts guiding him through the chaos. Willem, as always, was nearby, his voice a steadying presence. "Keep moving, Saifo. We've got this." The firefight raged on, with both sides sustaining heavy casualties. Colonel Erasmus directed the attack with precision, ensuring key positions were taken. By midday, the Plan base was in ruins. Documents and supplies were seized, and any remaining structures were destroyed. The South Africans had achieved their objective, but victory was bittersweet. The losses weighed heavily on every soldier, and the knowledge that the fight was far from over tempered any sense of triumph. As the convoy began its retreat, the aftermath of the battle became evident. The faces of the soldiers were marked by exhaustion and grief. Among the wounded was Corporal Jacob Stein, whose charismatic presence had bolstered morale. Despite his injuries, Jacob maintained his resolve. "We did what we came to do," he said through gritted teeth. "That's what matters." Saifo sat quietly as the convoy made its way back to the border. His thoughts drifted to the faces of the Plan fighters, men and women who had fought with the same determination as his comrades. "They believe in their cause as much as we do," he said aloud. Willem, seated beside him, nodded. "That's the tragedy of war, Saifo. It's never as simple as good versus evil." Back at the garrison, the returning soldiers were met with subdued applause. The victory was celebrated, but the losses were deeply felt. Colonel Erasmus delivered a somber address, reminding his men of the sacrifices made and the work still to be done. In the quiet days following the mission, letters from home arrived at the garrison. For Sifo, his sister's words brought a rare smile. "We're so proud of you," she wrote. "Stay safe and come back to us." Willem, too, received a letter, a brief but heartfelt note from his wife. "The children miss you terribly," it read. "I pray every day for your return." The sergeant folded the letter carefully, his expression a mix of sadness and determination. The letters were a reminder of the lives waiting beyond the war, a source of strength for the soldiers. For Sifo, they reinforced his resolve to see the conflict through, no matter how long it took. Operation Packer, the turning point of Angola. It was March 1988, and the rolling plains of southern Angola bore scars of relentless war. The South African border war, interwoven with the Angolan Civil War, had reached a critical juncture. The focus of all forces turned to the dusty battleground near the Quito River. This would become the stage for Operation Packer, a desperate attempt by the South African Defense Force, SADF, to crush the Angolan and Cuban forces entrenched east of Cuidaquanavale. For both sides, the stakes were unimaginably high. The SADF sought to break the Angolan advance and secure their ally, UNITA, from annihilation. Across the river, the Cuban and FAPLA, People's Armed Forces for the Liberation of Angola, units fortified their positions, determined to defend their ground at any cost. The battlefield buzzed with anticipation as the operation unfolded, a decisive chapter in a long and bitter struggle. The air was thick with tension on the morning of March 12, 1988, as the SADF began final preparations for their campaign. Commanders pored over maps of the Tumpo Triangle, a vital choke point between their forces and the remaining FAPLA troops. The key to victory lay in forcing the enemy back across the Quito River and destroying the bridge to prevent their return. General Jan Malan, leading the SADF forces, stood inside a hastily assembled command tent. The dim glow of kerosene lamps illuminated the strategic maps pinned to the walls. A cigar clenched between his teeth, he reviewed the plan with his officers. "We will sweep them east and cripple their ability to regroup. This is our chance to end this." Outside, the mechanized infantry of 82 Mechanized Brigade, a mix of seasoned permanent force soldiers and citizen force reservists, prepared for the coming battle. The rumble of elephant tanks filled the air as they rolled into formation. Among the soldiers was Corporal Peter van Rooyen, a reservist mechanic who had spent most of his life fixing farm equipment. Now, he faced the terrifying prospect of manning a machine gun in one of the lead tanks. Across the river, the Cuban and FAPLA forces readied their defenses. Under General Leopoldo Sintra Frias, the Cuban troops had bolstered their positions with mines, trenches, and artillery. The menacing silence of the night was broken by the occasional crack of a distant rifle or the roar of a jet overhead. For many soldiers on both sides, it was the calm before a storm they knew could consume them. The first skirmishes erupted with the dawn on March 13. The SADF artillery began a relentless bombardment, sending shells crashing into the enemy lines. Smoke billowed from the Shambinga heights as Cuban gunners retaliated, their rounds punching into the dry earth near the advancing South African columns. Corporal van Rooyen gripped his machine gun tightly as his tank rumbled toward the front. The landscape was a patchwork of dry grass and scorched soil. "Hold steady," shouted his commander, Lieutenant Botha. But no sooner had the words left his mouth than an explosion rocked the tank, throwing van Rooyen against the steel interior. They had struck a mine, one of many meticulously laid by Cuban engineers. Meanwhile, Cuban artillery targeted the SADF's advancing forces with precision. General Frias, observing from a hillside, muttered to his aide, "Let them come. The minefields will slow them, and then we'll bleed them dry." Despite setbacks, the SADF pressed forward, Infantry units dismounted from their radels, sweeping the terrain for mines while under constant fire. By nightfall, the battlefield was a chaotic mix of stalled vehicles, wounded soldiers, and the acrid stench of burning equipment. Day 2 of Operation Packer brought the operation's most harrowing challenge, the minefields. These treacherous obstacles, planted by FAPLA and Cuban forces, stretched across the SAF's path like a deadly spiderweb. Engineers with mine detectors crept forward under cover of darkness, but progress was slow and perilous. Private Hendrik Leroux, an SADF engineer, worked tirelessly to clear a path for the advancing tanks. Sweat poured down his face as his detector beeped over a suspicious patch of ground. "Careful," shouted his partner, Sergeant de Beer, but it was too late. A misstep triggered an explosion that hurled them both backward. Leroux survived, but the cost was high. The minefields claimed more lives than bullets that day. On the Cuban side, morale was bolstered by the SAF's struggles. FAPLA soldiers, emboldened by the resilience of their defenses, launched counterattacks under the cover of artillery fire. Though their assaults were repelled, they succeeded in delaying the South African advance. By March 15, 1988, the SADF forces closed in on the infamous Tumpo Triangle, a key strategic position east of Cuito-Cuanavale. The area was a natural fortress, bordered by the Cuito River on one side and dense minefields on the other. The FAPLA and Cuban forces entrenched there were well prepared for an assault. The SADF commanders knew they faced a daunting task. General Mallon paced within his command tent, his brow furrowed as he studied the terrain map. "If we don't dislodge them from the triangle, everything we've done so far will mean nothing," he declared. The plan was simple but risky, a coordinated push with tanks and infantry from the north, supported by artillery bombardments to weaken the enemy lines. Corporal Van Rooyen's tank was part of the northern assault group. The journey into the triangle felt like moving into the jaws of a beast. Cuban artillery rained down incessantly, and the air was filled with the screams of rockets and the thunder of exploding shells. Van Rooyen's heart raced as his tank commander barked orders, "Target that ridge. Fire." The FAPLA soldiers, dug into fortified positions, fought fiercely to hold their ground. Cuban advisors directed artillery strikes with remarkable precision, causing heavy casualties among the advancing SADF forces. The standoff continued late into the night, with neither side willing to give an inch. The next day saw the SADF escalate their assault on the Shambinga Heights, the last major stronghold before reaching the Cuito River. The heights, rising starkly from the surrounding plains, provided the Cuban and FAPLA forces a commanding view of the battlefield. Mortar teams and snipers stationed there turned the area into a death zone for the advancing South Africans. At sunrise, the SADF launched a daring flanking maneuver. Columns of Radels and Oliphant tanks rolled through a narrow corridor cleared by engineers overnight. Private Leroux, recovering from his injuries, rejoined his unit to assist with the final push. "It's now or never," he whispered to himself, gripping his rifle tightly. As the SADF forces climbed the heights, they encountered fierce resistance. Cuban machine gun nests spat fire, and FAPLA troops unleashed volleys of rocket-propelled grenades. The air was filled with smoke and dust, reducing visibility to almost nothing. Amidst the chaos, Van Rooyen's tank took a direct hit, disabling its turret. "Bail out," shouted the commander. Van Rooyen scrambled out, dragging an injured comrade to safety under a hail of bullets. By nightfall, the SADF had secured a foothold on the lower slopes of the heights, but the cost was devastating. Hundreds lay wounded or dead, and the enemy still held the high ground. As the battle dragged into its third week, Operation Packer reached a grim stalemate. The SADF forces had made significant inroads but were unable to achieve their primary objective of driving the FAPLA and Cuban troops across the Quito River. The minefields, relentless artillery fire, and well-coordinated defenses had turned the operation into a grueling war of attrition. In a makeshift field hospital behind the front lines, Private Leroux sat beside a wounded comrade, his hands trembling from exhaustion. "When will this end?" he muttered. The answer seemed elusive as the commanders grappled with the sobering reality that their advance was slowing to a crawl. On the Cuban side, General Frias remained steadfast. "We have them where we want them," he told his officers. "Let them exhaust themselves against our defenses. The river will be their grave." The SADF regrouped for one final push, mobilizing every available resource. Fresh reinforcements arrived, including artillery units and additional tanks. The soldiers, though battered and weary, steeled themselves for what they hoped would be the decisive assault. On the morning of March 23, the SADF launched their final assault. Artillery barrages lit up the sky as tanks and infantry surged forward in a desperate attempt to breach the FAPLA lines. Van Ruyen, now reassigned to an infantry unit, advanced alongside his comrades, his rifle shaking in his hands. The initial charge was met with a hail of fire from Cuban and FAPLA positions. Mortar shells exploded around the advancing troops, scattering men and machines. Despite the chaos, the SADF pressed on, inching closer to the river. Meanwhile, Cuban engineers worked frantically to reinforce their trenches and repair damage to their positions. Their determination was unyielding. "We hold here, no matter what," shouted a Cuban officer as his men fired volley after volley into the approaching ranks. By nightfall, the SADF had reached the edge of the Quito River but found the bridge heavily guarded and rigged with explosives. The final objective remained tantalizingly out of reach, and the cost of further attacks loomed heavily over the South African command. The Quito River Bridge stood as an unyielding barrier between the SADF and victory. Spanning the sluggish, muddy waters, it was the only passage for FAPLA and Cuban forces retreating west. For the SADF, destroying it was imperative to crippling their enemy's mobility in severing their supply lines. On March 25, under the cover of darkness, a small team of SADF engineers was tasked with a high-stakes mission to sabotage the bridge. Corporal Leroux, despite his injuries, volunteered to lead the group. "We've come too far to stop now," he said, clutching his toolkit as if it were a weapon. As they crept through the underbrush, Cuban sentries patrolled the bridge, their flashlights slicing through the night. The air was heavy with tension, every rustle of leaves sending the team's hearts racing. They worked swiftly, planting explosives at the bridge's structural supports. But before they could complete their task, a sentry's shout rang out, followed by gunfire. The engineers scrambled for cover, detonating what charges they had set. The resulting explosion damaged a section of the bridge but left it largely intact. The retreating FAPLA forces crossed the bridge at dawn, their tanks rumbling over the damaged structure. Though partially successful, the SADF engineers' mission failed to deliver the decisive blow needed to trap the enemy forces. Emboldened by the bridge's survival, the FAPLA and Cuban forces launched a counteroffensive on March 27. Their artillery, now concentrated on the SADF's forward positions, created a storm of fire and steel. Cuban MiG-23 jets roared overhead, targeting supply convoys and rear-line artillery positions. General Frias coordinated the assault with precision, ordering simultaneous infantry advances from multiple directions. His strategy aimed to stretch the SADF thin and force a retreat. "We must remind them who holds this land," he told his officers. Corporal Van Ruyen found himself in the thick of the counterattack, manning a machine gun nest. The ground around him shook as Cuban tanks approached, their silhouettes barely visible through the smoke. "Hold your fire until they're in range," his commander shouted. When the enemy drew near, a deafening exchange of fire erupted, the air filled with the crackle of bullets and the roar of explosions. Though the SADF managed to repel the attack, their lines were strained to the breaking point. The psychological toll on the soldiers was immense, and whispers of doubt began to circulate through the ranks. By early April, the battlefield east of Cuanavale had transformed into a desolate wasteland. The once proud Shambinga Heights were pockmarked with craters, littered with wrecked vehicles and the bodies of fallen soldiers. The stench of death hung heavy in the air, a grim reminder of the cost of war. Van Ruyen, now deeply shaken, stared out over the devastated landscape during a rare moment of quiet. "Is this what victory looks like?" he asked no one in particular. His comrades, equally disheartened, offered no reply. In their fortified positions, Cuban and FAPLA soldiers shared similar sentiments. Supplies were running low, and the constant bombardment had left many on edge. A Cuban medic named Ernesto tended to the wounded with a quiet determination, his thoughts far from the ideology that had brought him to Angola. "We're just men trying to survive," he muttered, wrapping a soldier's bandaged arm. Both sides prepared for one final confrontation, their hopes for a decisive outcome dwindling with each passing day. The SADF launched their last major offensive on April 9th, throwing everything they had into a desperate attempt to achieve their objective. Tanks rolled forward under cover of artillery fire, while infantry advanced through the smoldering remnants of the minefields. The Cuban and FAPLA forces responded with equal ferocity. Artillery batteries unleashed a relentless barrage, and snipers targeted SADF officers to disrupt their coordination. The fighting reached a fever pitch, with hand-to-hand combat erupting in some sectors. Private Leroux found himself pinned down in a trench as enemy fire raked the ground above. His radio crackled with the voice of his commanding officer, "We need reinforcements on the west flank." But the line was stretched too thin to send help. In the chaos, Leroux witnessed acts of both heroism and despair, his own courage tested to its limits. Despite their valiant efforts, the SADF failed to dislodge the enemy from their positions. The operation had reached its breaking point, and the commanders made the difficult decision to withdraw. As April 30th marked the end of Operation Packer, neither side could claim a decisive victory. The SADF had inflicted heavy casualties on the FAPLA and Cuban forces but failed to achieve their primary objectives. The bridge over the Quito River remained standing, and the Tumpo Triangle stayed firmly in enemy hands. General Mallon addressed his troops during the withdrawal, his voice tinged with both pride and regret. "You fought bravely, and history will remember your courage. But wars are not won by bravery alone." For the Cuban and FAPLA forces, the operation was a bittersweet triumph. They had defended their positions and secured a strategic stalemate, but the human cost was staggering. General Frias looked over the battlefield with a somber expression, knowing the price his men had paid for every inch of ground. As the dust settled, the larger war continued, with Operation Packer etched into history as a testament to the resilience and sacrifices of all who fought. The story of Operation DINGO. The sun sank low over Mozambique's horizon on November 22, 1977. Shadows stretched long across the dusty ground as the sky burned with crimson streaks. In the heart of a nation torn by conflict, an operation was about to unfold that would shape the course of a brutal war. This is the story of Operation DINGO, where strategy, sacrifice, and survival wove together in the fierce tapestry of the Rhodesian Bush War. In a war where guerrilla fighters hid among civilians, the lines between right and wrong often blurred. The story that follows is not just about generals and soldiers but about the civilians caught in the storm and the men who waged war in secret. As the world watched with indifference, Mozambique and Rhodesia became the stage for a battle whose echoes would reach far beyond their borders. The year was 1977, and Rhodesia was a nation fighting for its survival. Across its border in Mozambique, guerrilla fighters of the Zimbabwe African National Liberation Army, ZANLA, gathered in camps, training under the scorching sun. One of the largest of these was in Kimoyo, a complex hidden amid the bush, where recruits prepared to strike at Rhodesia's heart. Major Brian Robinson stood at the helm of a mission unlike any before. A calm and calculating man, he reviewed maps under the dim glow of a lamp in a war room. Rhodesian intelligence had pinpointed the Kimoyo camp's coordinates, revealing a sprawling network of huts, training grounds, and storage depots. Robinson knew that time was against them. Every day the enemy grew stronger, more numerous. Meanwhile, young recruits at Kimoyo sharpened their skills. Their rifles, worn and mismatched, symbolized a struggle fueled by desperation and dreams of freedom. Among them, 16-year-old Kuda gazed into the fire, listening to stories of battles fought and victories yet to come. His heart swelled with pride, but fear stirred beneath his courage. In the air, Rhodesian Hawker hunters and Canberra bombers waited in readiness. Pilots ran final checks on their aircraft, their hands steady but their minds racing with the knowledge that this mission would be perilous. Operation DINGO was about to begin, and with it, the lives of hundreds would change forever. The Rhodesian military knew that speed and precision would be the keys to success. Under the command of General Peter Walls, Operation DINGO took shape. The plan was audacious, a surprise air and ground assault on the heart of ZANLA operations at Kimoyo and a secondary strike at Tembu. Every moment counted, for secrecy was their strongest weapon. Major Brian Robinson and Air Force Director Norman Walsh coordinated a complex operation involving paratroopers, bombers, and helicopters. Rhodesian Alouette 3 helicopters would fly low and fast, each carrying soldiers prepared to jump into hostile territory. Canberra bombers, with payloads designed for maximum devastation, would unleash their fury on the camps. Every map, every radio frequency, every detail had to be perfect. There would be no second chances. As the plan spread through the ranks, tension thickened like a gathering storm. Soldiers sharpened their knives, checked their rifles, and whispered goodbyes to comrades. Sergeant Jack Mackenzie, a veteran of many battles, cleaned his weapon in silence. His thoughts drifted to his wife and child back home in Salisbury, the small life he fought to protect from a war that seemed endless. In the cover of night, planes roared to life on Rhodesian airstrips. Propellers spun into motion, and engines thundered in the dark. Pilots exchanged terse nods, knowing that by morning, some would not return. The mission was underway, and Rhodesia's fate hung on a knife's edge. As the sun rose on November 23, the Kimoyo camp stirred to life. Guerrilla fighters performed drills, and commanders reviewed tactics. No one suspected the storm that approached from the skies. The first wave of Rhodesian Canberras appeared like shadows against the dawn, silent until it was too late. Bombs fell, tearing into barracks, supply depots, and parade grounds. The camp erupted in chaos. Explosions thundered, and smoke coiled into the air. Fighters scrambled for cover as the ground shook beneath their feet. Kuda, heart pounding, dove into a trench. The sky was alive with fire and metal, and he clutched his rifle as if it were a lifeline. Around him, men shouted orders, but their words were lost in the deafening roar of war. Helicopters descended, blades slicing the air. Rhodesian soldiers, clad in green fatigues, leaped from the alouettes and stormed the camp. Gunfire cracked through the air. Sergeant Mackenzie led his men with steely resolve, eyes scanning for danger. He moved swiftly, heart steady, as the battle surged around him. Within minutes, the carefully planned assault turned into brutal close-quarters combat. Lives collided, and fates unraveled. The Rhodesians pressed forward, relentless, while the Zanla fighters fought with desperate fury. Victory was not assured, and the battle was far from over. The flames of battle devoured the Kimoyo camp, casting shadows across the bodies that lay broken in its wake. Smoke curled like dark serpents into the sky, the air thick with the acrid stench of burning wood, metal, and flesh. Kuda, his ears ringing from the blasts, felt the world collapse into a chaos of noise and fear. He crawled through the dust, clutching his rifle with trembling hands as the sound of gunfire echoed all around him. A Rhodesian soldier advanced through the smoldering ruins, his rifle steady, eyes scanning the carnage. His name was Private Andrew Taylor, a young man hardened by the relentless tide of war. He moved with practiced calm, stepping over shattered crates and torn canvas tents. Behind him, the rhythmic thudding of helicopter blades filled the air, alouettes circling like vultures over a dying prey. As bullets ricocheted against rocks and debris, Taylor spotted movement from the corner of his eye. His finger tightened on the trigger as he turned, his gaze meeting Kuda's terrified eyes. For a moment, time seemed to halt. Two young men on opposite sides of a bitter struggle stood locked in silent recognition. The distance between them spanned not just a few feet but the deep chasm of history, politics, and war. Taylor hesitated, the weight of his rifle heavy in his hands. Kuda, his breath shallow, clutched his weapon tighter. Before either could act, an explosion rocked the ground between them, throwing both into the dust. When Taylor rose, his target was gone, swallowed by the smoke and shadows. While Kimoyo burned, a second Rhodesian strike force moved toward Tembu, another key Zanla stronghold. The mission was clear: to cripple the enemy's ability to wage war and destroy their infrastructure. Rhodesian bombers soared over the African plains, engines roaring like thunder. Below, Zanla recruits marched in formation, unaware of the storm descending upon them. At the command center in Salisbury, General Walls and his staff monitored the operation with grim focus. Radios crackled with updates from the front. Enemy positions neutralized at Grid Point Alpha, a voice reported. The room was tense with anticipation, every moment a knife's edge between success and disaster. Back at Tembu, the first wave of bombs struck with devastating force. Wooden structures splintered under the impact, and flames roared to life. Survivors scattered like leaves in a gale, their cries lost amid the cacophony of destruction. Among them was Josiah Tangagara, one of Zanla's top commanders, whose leadership had been instrumental in the guerrilla movement. Calm under pressure, he barked orders, rallying his men. The Rhodesians pressed their advantage. Helicopters hovered low, disgorging soldiers into the heart of the camp. Machine guns chattered, and grenades exploded in sharp bursts. The battle was fierce and unrelenting, a deadly dance of strategy, speed, and firepower. Yet, even as victory seemed within reach, the cost of war etched itself deeply into every soul on the field. The battle at Tembu raged like a storm with no calm in sight. The Rhodesian soldiers moved with practiced precision, their boots crunching the earth as they advanced under a sky darkened by smoke. Machine guns roared from defensive positions, and Rhodesian paratroopers, seasoned from countless raids, pressed forward without hesitation. Josiah Tangagara remained a commanding presence amid the chaos. His voice, calm but forceful, carried over the din of war. He directed his fighters, urging them to regroup. "Hold your ground," he shouted. "We are stronger than they think." The young men around him, many barely out of their teens, clutched their rifles and fought with a ferocity born of desperation and belief. Above the battlefield, the engines of Hawker hunters screamed as they swept down for another bombing run. The earth trembled under the impact of their payloads. Trenches caved in, and the air filled with dust and fire. One moment, a line of fighters stood shoulder to shoulder, rifles raised; the next, they vanished in a cloud of smoke. Could have found himself amid the carnage, his eyes wide with horror as the world crumbled around him. Sergeant Jack Mackenzie advanced through the ruins with eyes hardened by years of war. He felt the weight of each step, the crushing burden of knowing that every bullet fired, every life taken, would stay with him long after the battle had ended. As he turned a corner, he came face to face with a young guerrilla fighter. Their eyes met, a heartbeat of recognition, and Mackenzie pulled the trigger. As the day stretched into its bloody twilight, the Rhodesians realized that their mission's greatest danger was not just the bullets and bombs. Guerrilla warfare was a game of shadows, and Zanla's fighters had mastered it. Hidden snipers picked off soldiers from behind cover, and booby traps lay waiting in the most innocent-looking paths. Private Taylor crouched behind a boulder, his heart hammering. He had seen too many fall already, men with whom he had shared meals and laughter now lay cold on the ground. He felt the oppressive weight of silence, broken only by the distant crack of gunfire. A rustle in the brush made him whip around, his rifle poised. It was only a bird, startled into flight. Elsewhere in the camp, Tandagara orchestrated a retreat. He knew when a battle could no longer be won, and his priority was survival, of himself, his men, and the movement they represented. "Pull back," he ordered. "Regroup and fight another day." His voice, though steady, carried a bitter edge. The cost of this battle was high, and its lessons would not be forgotten. As night fell over Tembu, the Rhodesian forces began their extraction. Helicopters, engines straining, lifted the soldiers from the smoking ruins. Below, the fires of the battle flickered in the dark, a grim reminder of the day's brutality. The mission was deemed a tactical success, but the human cost weighed heavily on both sides. For those who survived, the war was far from over. Nightfall brought a fragile stillness over Kimoyo and Tembu. The fires, once roaring with fierce intensity, now smoldered in heaps of ash and ruin. The stench of smoke and death lingered in the air as Rhodesian helicopters retreated into the distance. Their mission had left devastation in its wake, fields scarred, buildings flattened, and lives forever altered. Kuda sat amid the ruins, trembling, the weight of survival pressing on his chest. Around him, the camp lay silent save for the crackle of dying embers. His rifle, the weapon he once held with pride, now felt like a burden in his hands. Tears traced lines of dirt down his face as he mourned fallen comrades, boys who had laughed and trained beside him, now lost to a war that seemed endless. Far from the battlefield, the Rhodesian command center buzzed with subdued energy. General Peter Walls stood before a large map, its surface marked with lines and symbols of the completed operation. Reports flowed in, objectives destroyed, hundreds of Zanla fighters killed, and the camps neutralized. Walls knew this was a tactical victory, but victory in war was never simple. "Success comes at a price," he muttered, turning away from the board. His thoughts weighed on the civilians caught in the assault, women and children who had not chosen this fight. War, he knew, did not discriminate between the guilty and the innocent. The conflict stretched far beyond borders and bullet points on a map. The human cost of Operation Dingo would echo long after the gunfire ceased. The survivors of Kimoyo and Tembu scattered into the surrounding bush. Exhaustion gnawed at their limbs, but fear drove them forward. Tongagara and his lieutenants led the remnants of their forces, navigating by the faint light of the stars. Every shadow seemed alive with danger, every sound a potential ambush. For Zanla, retreat was not defeat, it was a strategy for survival and continued resistance. As they marched through the dark, Tongagara whispered to his closest advisor, "The Rhodesians think they've won. But war is not a single battle. We will rise again." His words, steady and sure, carried the determination that had kept the struggle alive for so long. Hope, even in retreat, was a powerful weapon. Back in Rhodesia, the soldiers who had fought at Kimoyo and Tembu were greeted with quiet relief. There were no parades, no celebrations. The war was too close, too personal, for triumphal displays. Sergeant Mackenzie walked into his barracks and sank onto his cot. His hands, calloused and bloodied, trembled as he stared into the dark. Victory had a bitter taste. In a small village near the border, a woman named Miriam sat by a fire, her infant son cradled in her arms. She had lost her husband to the war and now feared for her brothers, who had joined Zanla. The flames danced before her, flickering shadows of an uncertain future. She prayed for peace but knew it was a dream far beyond her reach. As dawn broke over Kimoyo, the first rays of light revealed the full extent of the devastation. The once bustling camp, filled with the sounds of training drills and laughter, now lay in eerie silence. The huts were reduced to smoldering rubble, and the training grounds were pockmarked with craters. Survivors picked their way through the wreckage, their eyes hollow and their steps heavy with the weight of grief and exhaustion. Kuda moved cautiously, his heart heavy with sorrow and anger. He had seen comrades fall, boys his age, faces twisted in fear and pain as bullets found them. Now, each step through the ruins was a reminder of what had been lost. He clenched his fists, vowing silently that he would fight on, that the dream of liberation would not die with those who had fallen. In Salisbury, the Rhodesian government declared Operation Dingo a triumph. Newspapers heralded the destruction of the Kimoyo and Tembu camps as a significant blow to Zanla's capabilities. Yet behind the public announcements, a darker reality loomed. The war was far from over. Every victory came with consequences, and the seeds of future battles were sown amid the ruins of the present. Meanwhile, Tongagara gathered his remaining fighters in a hidden clearing. His voice, calm but resolute, carried over the weary faces of those who had survived. "We have lost much," he said, "but we are not defeated. Every fallen comrade strengthens our resolve. We will rebuild. We will continue." His words, a spark in the darkness, reignited the determination in their hearts. The attack on Kimoyo sent ripples across the region. International reactions varied, some condemned Rhodesia's actions as a massacre, while others viewed it as a necessary strike in a brutal war. Mozambique, which had provided sanctuary to Zanla fighters, was thrust further into the conflict. Diplomatic ties strained as neighboring nations weighed their positions. In the heart of Lusaka, Zambia, where ZANU leadership had taken refuge, Robert Mugabe and Edgar Tekra met in a dimly lit room. The atmosphere was tense as they discussed the ramifications of the attack. "We must intensify our efforts," Mugabe declared. "Every strike they make only strengthens our cause. The people will rise with us." Tekra nodded, his face grim but determined. The struggle for independence was a long and bloody path, but retreat was not an option. In Rhodesia, the military prepared for the inevitable retaliation. Soldiers polished their weapons and reviewed tactics, knowing that Zanla would not remain silent. Sergeant Mackenzie felt the weight of another campaign pressing on him. His wife's letters lay unopened in his pocket, messages from a world he longed to return to but could no longer imagine. The skies above the region remained tense with the possibility of future raids. The war, fueled by pain, politics, and pride, churned relentlessly forward. In homes, camps, and command posts, hearts beat with a shared knowledge. The conflict had entered a new phase, and its end was nowhere in sight. The survivors of the Kimoyo and Tembu attacks scattered like seeds in the wind. Hidden deep within the bush, they found refuge in makeshift camps, where the wounds of battle were tended with scarce supplies. The echoes of war remained in their hollowed eyes and weary voices. Kuda sat by a fire, his hands wrapped around a bowl of thin porridge, staring into the flames as if they might explain the horrors he had witnessed. Beside him, an older fighter named Tendai rested a hand on his shoulder. "You have seen much," Tendai said softly. "But war is not just death. It is struggle. It is survival. We fight because we must, for those who cannot." His words hung in the air like smoke, truths forged in fire and loss. Kuda nodded but said nothing. The weight of his heart could not be lightened with words. In Salisbury, the Rhodesian military tallied its successes. The precision of Operation DINGO had dealt a devastating blow to Zanla's forces, but the price of war was written in the eyes of soldiers returning home. Sergeant Mackenzie, now back at his base, stared out over the parade grounds. Each blade of grass seemed too green, too peaceful, in a world that had seen so much blood. He reached into his pocket and finally unfolded a letter from his wife, her words a fragile tether to a life that felt impossibly distant. As reports from international observers filtered in, condemnation and praise mingled in a chorus of divided opinion. The world watched as Rhodesia, Mozambique, and the freedom fighters of Zimbabwe remained locked in a deadly embrace. Leaders spoke of strategy and sovereignty, but in the hearts of the people, the war was measured in lost sons, shattered homes, and hopes that burned with every bomb. Josiah Tangagara sat beneath the shade of a sprawling tree, his face shadowed with weariness. Around him, his remaining officers gathered in silence. Their forces had been shattered, their camps destroyed, yet his voice carried strength. "This war was never going to be won in a day," he said. "Our cause lives in the hearts of the people, not in the buildings we lost." In the distance, the soft rustle of leaves hid the approach of a messenger. He arrived breathless, his clothes torn from days of travel. "The Rhodesians prepare for another offensive," he warned. Tangagara nodded slowly. Every battle lost or won was but a step on the long road to freedom. Strategy, not sentiment, would decide their future. At home in Salisbury, Mackenzie returned to his family, the quiet of their small home a fragile balm for his soul. His wife embraced him, her touch warm but tentative. She felt the distance in his gaze, the weight of what he had seen but would never share. Their child clung to his leg, too young to understand why his father's arms, once strong with laughter, now trembled with the burden of memory. The fields of Zimbabwe lay under the same sky that had seen centuries of struggle. War lingered in the hearts of its people, but so did the unbroken desire for peace. In every village, in every camp, the future remained uncertain, a story yet to be written with bullets or with ballots. The rhythm of war beat on. For the Rhodesian soldiers who had survived Operation DINGO, life moved in the uneasy space between battles. Sergeant Mackenzie spent his nights staring into the dark, hearing the echoes of explosions and the cries of the wounded in his dreams. His wife often sat silently beside him, her presence a balm against the memories he could not escape. Each day, he put on his uniform again, knowing the war's demands would call him back into the fray. Kuda, hiding with other Zanla fighters deep in Mozambique's bush, bore his own scars, wounds that bled from the inside. His hands had learned the weight of a rifle, his heart had learned the sting of loss, but his soul still wrestled with fear. Tendai, ever watchful, taught him to read the signs of the land. The earth speaks if you listen, he said. The wind tells you where danger lies. Your steps must be quieter than the breath of a sleeping lion. In Salisbury's war rooms, maps were marked with fresh targets. Rhodesian forces prepared for new offensives, their leaders emboldened by the success of DINGO. Air Force Director Norman Walsh reviewed aerial reconnaissance photos with a sharp eye. We've crippled them, but they'll regroup. This isn't the end. His words were prophetic. Guerrilla warfare was a beast that thrived in shadows, and the war was far from over. Across Africa, news of the Kimoyo massacre rippled through political corridors. Accusations of civilian casualties fueled international outrage. Mozambique's President Samora Machel condemned Rhodesia's actions as barbaric. Yet for every denunciation, there was silent approval from those who saw Rhodesia's survival as a buffer against spreading communist influence. The war, a tangled web of ideologies and alliances, consumed nations and lives alike. The Rhodesian Bush War was not confined to battlefields. It spilled into homes, schools, and fields. Along rural paths, villagers feared every shadow, for war did not distinguish between combatants and innocents. Miriam, the widow living near the border, kept her child close as stories of raids and reprisals traveled from mouth to mouth. Her brothers fought with Zanla, and each day she prayed they would return. In the countryside, Rhodesian security forces patrolled with eyes sharp for ambushes. Mines were buried under dirt roads, ready to explode beneath unwary feet. The landscape itself became a weapon, its beauty hiding death beneath tall grasses and sun-dappled clearings. Private Taylor, hardened by Kimoyo, felt the weight of danger with every step. His world was reduced to a series of threats, a glint of metal, a sudden movement, a sound too sharp to be natural. In Lusaka, ZANU leaders plotted their next moves. Tangagara's tactical mind worked tirelessly. We need to adapt, he said to his advisors. Our strength lies in mobility. If we remain in one place, we are targets. Maps spread before him bore marks of planned attacks and new routes of supply. Every decision carried a cost, but freedom had no price too high. As the rains came, drenching the lands in torrents, rivers swelled, and the paths of war grew treacherous. Nature, indifferent to human suffering, made no alliances. The Rhodesian Bush War, fueled by bullets and blood, churned forward like the rivers, unstoppable, unyielding, and carving new scars into the land with each passing day. The Rhodesian Bush War, a conflict rooted in the dusty savannas of southern Africa, was a battle for identity, sovereignty, and survival. Between 1964 and 1979, the land known as Rhodesia became a theater of war that pitted guerrilla fighters against well-equipped security forces, with global powers maneuvering in the shadows. This is a story of resilience, betrayal, and a yearning for freedom that shaped a nation's destiny. The 1950s in southern Rhodesia were a time of unease. The simmering tension between the white minority government and the African majority began to boil over as nationalist movements gained momentum. The British colony, once heralded as a bastion of colonial order, found itself on the precipice of upheaval. In the cities of Salisbury and Bulawayo, whispers of defiance spread. African nationalist leaders, including the fiery Joshua Komu and the determined Robert Mugabe, began rallying the masses. The push for independence grew louder, and the divide between the aspirations of the black majority and the entrenched white regime deepened. By 1964, after years of civil disobedience and growing unrest, the political battle transformed into armed struggle. Guerrilla fighters of the Zimbabwe African National Liberation Army, ZANLA, and the Zimbabwe People's Revolutionary Army, ZIPRA, began training in neighboring countries. The forested borders of Mozambique and Zambia became the crucibles for what would soon erupt into full-blown war. When Ian Smith declared Rhodesia's Unilateral Declaration of Independence, UDI, in 1965, he defied Britain and the international community. Smith's government sought to maintain white minority rule, refusing to transition to majority governance. For many Rhodesians of European descent, this was a fight to protect their way of life, their land, and their heritage. The declaration was met with global condemnation. Economic sanctions by the United Nations aimed to cripple Rhodesia's economy, yet the country's resourcefulness kept it afloat. Meanwhile, the African nationalist movements intensified their calls for liberation, framing the UDI as yet another act of oppression. Villagers in the rural heartlands bore the brunt of this escalating tension. Farmers fortified their homesteads, while guerrilla fighters sought to win the hearts and minds of the rural populace. Children carried messages between fighters and their sympathizers, risking their lives for the promise of freedom. The savannah became both a battleground and a graveyard. The early stages of the conflict saw ZANLA and ZIPRA adopt guerrilla tactics against the Rhodesian security forces. Inspired by Maoist principles, ZANLA operatives prioritized the rural population, seeking their support and embedding themselves within the community. ZIPRA, on the other hand, focused on conventional military strategies, preparing for large-scale engagements. The Rhodesian government responded with brutal efficiency. The Sela Scouts, an elite counterinsurgency unit, were deployed to infiltrate guerrilla networks. Posing as freedom fighters, they sowed distrust and confusion among the ranks of ZANLA and ZIPRA. In the villages, civilians often found themselves caught in a deadly crossfire, accused of aiding one side or the other. For guerrilla fighters like Tonderai, a young recruit from Mashonaland, the struggle was deeply personal. Tonderai had watched his father's fields burned by Rhodesian soldiers, his brothers beaten for suspected collaboration with the rebels. With each passing day, his resolve to fight grew stronger, his vision for an independent Zimbabwe sharper. As the conflict deepened, the Rhodesian Bush War became a proxy for Cold War rivalries. The Soviet Union and China supplied arms and training to ZIPRA and ZANLA, respectively, while Western powers, including South Africa and Portugal, provided covert support to the Rhodesian government. Neighboring countries played pivotal roles in the war's trajectory. Mozambique's independence in 1975 under Frelimo created a new front for Rhodesian forces to defend. Zambia's porous border became a lifeline for guerrillas seeking refuge and resupply. For villagers in these border regions, life became a precarious existence. Bombings by the Rhodesian Air Force turned once thriving communities into ghost towns. Families fled into the bush, their homes reduced to ash. Yet, amidst the destruction, hope lingered. Songs of liberation echoed in the forests, and freedom fighters vowed to endure. By the early 1970s, Rhodesia's counterinsurgency strategy intensified. Operation Hurricane, launched in 1972, aimed to crush the growing insurgency in the northeastern regions. The operation's scale was unprecedented, with thousands of troops deployed to secure villages, patrol borders, and hunt down guerrilla forces. Villages were cordoned off into protected areas, encircled by barbed wire and patrolled by armed guards. These protected villages, designed to cut off guerrilla access to supplies, became prisons for their inhabitants. Disease and hunger spread rapidly, further fueling resentment against the Rhodesian government. Despite the hardships, the guerrillas adapted. Utilizing the dense vegetation and their knowledge of the terrain, they launched ambushes and sabotage operations. Railway lines were derailed, and electricity pylons toppled, plunging Rhodesian cities into darkness. The war was no longer confined to the bush, it began seeping into urban centers. The journey of the Rhodesian Bush War is far from over. By 1975, the Rhodesian Bush War had reached a grim crescendo. Both sides bore the scars of relentless conflict. The bush was no longer a sanctuary but a place where shadows whispered of ambushes and fields brimmed with landmines. It was here, in the bloodied savannah, that the lives of countless innocents and combatants alike were changed forever. Among these were communities caught in the middle, families who had once thrived on fertile lands but were now displaced, living in makeshift shelters along the borders of Zambia and Mozambique. Farmers who once tilled their fields now crouched in trenches as mortar fires shattered the silence. For these people, neutrality was not an option. Allegiances, whether real or perceived, could spell life or death. The Rhodesian government continued its scorched earth policy, destroying villages suspected of harboring guerrillas. Yet, each brutal act only deepened the resolve of the insurgents. Fighters like Tendai, a young woman who had joined Zanla after witnessing the execution of her brother, found renewed purpose in every loss. Her journey symbolized the resilience and desperation of those caught in this brutal struggle. On the other side, the Rhodesian security forces faced their own tribulations. Soldiers lived in constant fear of roadside bombs and nighttime assaults. Many began questioning the morality of their mission, but orders were orders, and the cost of dissent was high. The Sela Scouts, a shadowy force feared by both guerrillas and civilians, played a central role in this phase of the war. Known for their cunning and ruthlessness, they blended into the bush, often masquerading as guerrillas to sow discord and gather intelligence. Their operations were as effective as they were controversial. One such mission took place deep in the Matasa district, where guerrilla forces were believed to have set up a training camp. Disguised as Zanla fighters, the scouts infiltrated the camp and dismantled it from within. The operation was a success, but the civilian casualties it caused left a lingering bitterness in the local population. For guerrillas like Cutakwash, these betrayals were personal. He had once trusted a man who turned out to be a Sela scout. The betrayal cost him his best friend and fueled a burning hatred for the Rhodesian forces. Stories like his were common, illustrating how the war's psychological toll matched its physical devastation. While the war raged on the battlefield, tensions within the nationalist movements threatened their unity. Zanla, led by Robert Mugabe and aligned with China, often clashed ideologically and strategically with Zipra, under Joshua Komu and supported by the Soviet Union. These divisions sometimes spilled into violence, with skirmishes breaking out between the two factions. In Lusaka, Zambia, where many of these leaders sought refuge, heated debates about strategy and vision took place. Mugabe argued for a grassroots-driven approach, embedding fighters among the rural population. Komu favored a more conventional military buildup, aiming for large-scale confrontations. These differing philosophies strained their fragile alliance, a divide that would have repercussions long after the war. Despite these rifts, both factions understood the importance of presenting a united front. Periodic meetings and public declarations of unity were made, but the underlying tensions were never far from the surface. For fighters on the ground, these divisions were both confusing and demoralizing, yet they pressed on, driven by the promise of freedom. In August 1976, the Nyazonia refugee camp in Mozambique became the site of one of the most harrowing chapters in the war. The camp, housing thousands of displaced civilians and guerrillas, was attacked by Rhodesian forces. They believed it to be a Zanla training ground, a claim later contested by international observers. The assault was swift and brutal. Rhodesian troops disguised as Frelimo soldiers infiltrated the camp before opening fire. In the chaos that followed, over 1,000 lives were lost. Survivors described scenes of unimaginable horror, families torn apart, bodies strewn across the grounds, and fires consuming what little remained of the camp. The massacre drew widespread condemnation. It galvanized international support for the nationalist movements and highlighted the Rhodesian regime's desperation. For those who survived, like Chipo, a mother who lost her 2 children, the tragedy was a turning point. Her sorrow transformed into determination, and she began aiding guerrilla fighters by smuggling supplies across the border. By the late 1970s, the war had spread like wildfire. Rhodesia's borders were no longer secure, and the guerrillas had established a formidable presence in both rural and urban areas. Every road became a potential death trap, lined with landmines. Every village, a battleground. The Rhodesian Air Force intensified its bombing campaigns, targeting guerrilla camps in Mozambique and Zambia. These raids, while devastating, often missed their marks and resulted in civilian casualties. International pressure mounted against Rhodesia, with countries like the United States and the United Kingdom calling for an end to the violence. Within the country, the resolve of the white minority began to waver. Economic sanctions, combined with the toll of the war, strained their resources and morale. Yet, Ian Smith remained steadfast, insisting that Rhodesia would never bow to majority rule. For guerrillas like Tonderai and Tendai, these were the war's darkest days. The victories they celebrated were tempered by the heavy losses they endured. But their spirits remained unbroken, and they clung to the belief that freedom was within reach. In November 1977, the Rhodesian security forces launched Operation DINGO, a daring and meticulously planned attack on Zanla bases at Kimoyo and Tembu in Mozambique. The goal was to strike a decisive blow against the insurgents, who were growing in strength and numbers. As dawn broke over Kimoyo, the Rhodesian Air Force unleashed a barrage of bombs, targeting Zanla's main camp. The cacophony of explosions echoed through the surrounding forests, scattering fighters and civilians alike. Helicopters followed, dropping troops who swiftly moved to secure the area. For many guerrillas, the attack was a nightmare brought to life. Tendai, now a seasoned Zanla operative, recalled the chaos as comrades scrambled for cover amidst the relentless assault. Though the camp was decimated, Zanla's spirit was not. Survivors like Tendai vowed to rebuild and continue the struggle, even as they mourned the immense loss of life. Operation DINGO was hailed as a tactical victory for Rhodesia, but its long-term impact was less clear. While it temporarily disrupted Zanla operations, it also drew international condemnation, further isolating the Rhodesian government. As the war escalated, the civilian population bore an increasingly heavy burden. Protected villages, a cornerstone of Rhodesia's counterinsurgency strategy, were overcrowded and under-resourced. Families were uprooted from ancestral lands and forced into fenced enclosures, their movements tightly controlled. For many, these protected areas felt more like prisons. Disease spread rapidly, and food supplies were scarce. Civilians were caught in a cruel paradox, accused of collaborating with guerrillas if they remained outside the villages, yet viewed with suspicion by the Rhodesian forces if they lived within. Among these displaced communities was an elderly storyteller named Gogo Nyirai. Known for her tales of resilience and hope, she became a source of comfort for those around her. Her stories often wove in the struggles of the present with the triumphs of the past, reminding her people that they had overcome hardship before and could do so again. Meanwhile, guerrillas like Tonderai relied on these communities for support, knowing full well the risks involved. Each loaf of bread smuggled to the fighters was an act of defiance, a small but meaningful contribution to the larger cause. In 1978 and 1979, 2 civilian airliners were shot down by Zipper forces using Soviet-supplied surface-to-air missiles. The tragedies, involving Air Rhodesia Flight 825 and Flight 827, shocked the world and underscored the war's brutality. Flight 825, en route from Kariba to Salisbury, was hit shortly after takeoff. The plane crashed into the bush, and while some passengers survived the initial impact, many were killed by guerrillas who arrived on the scene. The attack drew international outrage, even from Zipper's allies, as the targeting of civilians crossed a line that few could justify. The second attack, less than a year later, claimed even more lives. These incidents highlighted the desperation of both sides as the conflict reached its climax. For Rhodesians, the airliner attacks reinforced their fears that the war was no longer confined to the borders. For Zipra, the incidents were strategic missteps that alienated potential supporters. Survivors of these tragedies, like young Sarah Grant, whose parents perished in Flight 825, became symbols of resilience. Sarah's story of survival and her plea for peace resonated with many, a poignant reminder of the war's human cost. 1978 was a year of intensified violence and mounting pressure. Rhodesian forces expanded their cross-border raids, targeting guerrilla camps in Mozambique, Zambia, and even Angola. These operations, though successful in inflicting heavy casualties on the insurgents, also strained Rhodesia's military resources and drew sharp criticism from neighboring states. For guerrillas, the year was one of both hardship and progress. Zipra's conventional forces clashed with Rhodesian troops near the Zambezi River, marking a significant escalation in the conflict. Meanwhile, Zanla's strategy of rural infiltration continued to disrupt Rhodesian supply lines and communications. In the villages, the divide between those who supported the guerrillas and those who sided with the government deepened. Families were torn apart by suspicion and fear. In some cases, brothers found themselves fighting on opposite sides, their shared blood no match for the ideological rift. Yet, amidst the chaos, there were moments of humanity. In a remote village near Mount Darwin, a Rhodesian soldier named John saved the life of a guerrilla fighter he found wounded in the bush. The act of compassion was fleeting, the two parted ways, knowing they would likely meet again as enemies. But for a brief moment, the war's divisions seemed surmountable. By 1979, the toll of the war on both human and economic was undeniable. Sanctions, international isolation, and the unrelenting insurgency forced the Rhodesian government to the negotiating table. The Lancaster House Conference in London marked the beginning of the end for Rhodesia as it was known. The talks, brokered by the British government, brought together Ian Smith's administration, African nationalist leaders, and international mediators. The negotiations were tense, with each side seeking to secure their vision for the future of the nation. For Smith, it was about preserving some semblance of white minority influence. For leaders like Mugabe and Komu, it was about ensuring genuine majority rule. Outside the conference rooms, the world watched with bated breath. In Rhodesia, both guerrillas and soldiers held their fire, awaiting the outcome. For civilians, the talks offered a glimmer of hope that the years of bloodshed might finally end. After weeks of intense debate, an agreement was reached. Rhodesia would transition to majority rule, paving the way for the creation of Zimbabwe. For many, the news was met with relief and celebration. But for others, the wounds of the war were too fresh, the loss is too great to rejoice. As 1979 drew to a close, the Rhodesian Bush War reached its final, desperate stages. Both sides understood that the conflict was nearing an end, but the fighting persisted with unrelenting intensity. For the guerrilla fighters of Zanla and Zipra, every strike against Rhodesian forces was a step closer to victory. For Rhodesian soldiers, each skirmish felt like a battle to preserve the world they had built. In the countryside, the air was thick with tension. Villages bore the scars of years of conflict, with burnt-out huts and abandoned fields as grim reminders of what had been lost. Families whispered of peace but dared not believe it until they saw it with their own eyes. The Sela Scouts and other elite Rhodesian units continued their relentless counterinsurgency operations. Despite their efficiency, even they began to feel the weight of an unwinnable war. Morale among Rhodesian forces faltered as news of the Lancaster House Agreement spread, signaling the end of the white minority government's rule. For guerrilla fighters like Tendai, the final days were bittersweet. Victory was near, but the losses endured weighed heavily on their spirits. Tendai had lost comrades and family members, and though she envisioned an independent Zimbabwe, she wondered if the cost had been too high. The Lancaster House Agreement was signed in December 1979, officially ending the war and laying the groundwork for Zimbabwe's independence. The agreement mandated a ceasefire, the integration of guerrilla forces into the national military, and democratic elections. For many, it was a long-awaited triumph. For others, it was a leap into an uncertain future. In the days following the ceasefire, the atmosphere in Rhodesia was surreal. Fighters who had once faced each other in battle now stood side by side in assembly points, as stipulated by the agreement. The transition was not without its challenges. Distrust lingered, and sporadic skirmishes continued as some guerrilla factions resisted laying down their arms. In Harare, then still called Salisbury, preparations for elections were underway. The city buzzed with a mix of hope and apprehension. Robert Mugabe's ZANU-PF and Joshua Komu's ZAPU campaigned fervently, promising to rebuild the nation and address the injustices of the past. For civilians like Chipo, who had endured years of displacement and loss, the elections symbolized a chance for renewal. She joined long lines of voters, casting her ballot with trembling hands, tears streaming down her face as she imagined a better future for her children. The elections of 1980 marked a turning point in the history of Rhodesia, soon to become Zimbabwe. For weeks, the nation held its breath as international observers monitored the process, ensuring it was free and fair. Despite isolated incidents of violence and intimidation, the elections proceeded smoothly. Robert Mugabe emerged as the clear victor, with ZANU-PF winning a majority of the seats. His victory was met with jubilation among his supporters, who saw it as a validation of their struggle. In the streets of Harare, celebrations erupted, with people singing liberation songs and waving the new Zimbabwean flag. Yet, not everyone shared in the euphoria. Many white Rhodesians, particularly those who had supported Ian Smith's regime, faced an uncertain future. Some began leaving the country, fearing retribution or the loss of their privileged status. Others resolved to stay, determined to find their place in the new Zimbabwe. For Tendai and Tonderai, the election results were a moment of triumph. They had fought for this day, and now it had come. But as they celebrated, they also knew the real work was just beginning. Building a united and prosperous Zimbabwe would require more than just the end of the war. On April 18, 1980, Zimbabwe officially gained independence. The day was marked by a grand ceremony in Harare, attended by dignitaries from around the world. Prince Charles represented the British Crown, handing over the instruments of independence to Robert Mugabe, the nation's first Prime Minister. The celebrations were a mix of joy and solemnity. For many Zimbabweans, it was a moment to honor the sacrifices of those who had fought and died for freedom. Families gathered in their homes and community halls, sharing stories of resilience and survival. Tendai stood among the crowd at Rufaro Stadium, where the ceremony took place. As the Zimbabwean flag was raised for the first time, she felt a swell of pride. She thought of her parents, her brothers, and her comrades who had not lived to see this day. Their sacrifices had not been in vain. Yet, amidst the celebration, the challenges facing Zimbabwe loomed large. The scars of the war ran deep, and the nation's economy, infrastructure, and social fabric had been left in tatters. It would take years, perhaps decades, to heal. In the years following independence, Zimbabwe faced the daunting task of nation building. The government focused on education, land reform, and economic reconstruction, but the legacy of the war remained a constant presence. Former fighters struggled to reintegrate into society, and tensions between ZANU and ZAPU threatened to undermine the fragile peace. For Chipo, life after the war was a mix of relief and uncertainty. She returned to her village, only to find it unrecognizable. The fields were overgrown, and many of her neighbors had left. Yet, she resolved to rebuild, planting seeds in the soil and teaching her children about the sacrifices made for their freedom. Tendai and Tonderai also faced new challenges. As veterans, they were hailed as heroes, but they found it difficult to transition to civilian life. The memories of the war haunted their dreams, and the camaraderie they had shared with their comrades was difficult to replace. Zimbabwe's independence was a hard-won victory, but it was also a beginning. The nation had emerged from the shadow of colonial rule, but the road ahead was uncertain. The people of Zimbabwe, scarred yet hopeful, were determined to forge a brighter future.